Naked imperialism. Introduction. After the attack, the war and terrorism. Imperialism and empire. Monopoly capital and the new globalization. U.S. military bases and empire. The rediscovery of imperialism. U.S. imperial ambitions and Iraq. Imperial America and war. The new age of imperialism. Kipling, The White Man's Burden, and U.S. imperialism. 10 Is Iraq another Vietnam? 11. The U.S. empire, Pax Americana or Pax Americana. 12. Empire ol Barrel, Arism. 13. The failure of empire notes. Global warfare, putatively against terrorism but more realistically in the service of imperialism, is the dominant political reality of the opening decade of the 21st century. Glorification of empire by leading U.S. pundits, politicians, and corporate leaders is as great as at any time in history. The influential writer Robert Kaplan, a correspondent for the Addermel 1, proudly proclaims on the opening page of his 2005 book Journal CMM 15T/If Amerimen, Military on the Ground, by the turn of the 21st century the United States military had already appropriated the entire earth, and was ready to flood the most obscure areas of it with troops at a moment's notice. Kaplan goes on to praise what he calls the idealistic content of Rudyard Kipling's racist poem The White Man's Burden, written to justify U.S. conquest and colonization of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War of 1898. And he lauds the U.S. military trap dividing the entire planet into 5 distinct unified command zones, comparing it to a similar NTAP first introduced by the German geopolitical theorist and Nazi ideologue Karl Haushofer, whose views of conquest and Lelemi directly influenced Hitler. The United States, having vanquished Germany's budding world empire in World War II, Kaplan tells us, now had operational requirements for maintaining its own American empire. Such bellicose views could be more easily ignored if the United States were not engaged in a new period of naked imperialism, one that has until read a period of disorder and trauma allisting the entire world. Thus far, mainstream social science in the United States has had little success in explaining these developments. With few exceptions, the terrorist attacks of September 1, 2001 are treated as if they literally fell out ol the skies or else emanated from the head of one man, Osama bin Laden. No serious treatment old historic role ol imperialism in the development olu.s. capitalism and in its struggle for global political, economic, and military hegemony is evident in the dominant mainstream accounts. The invasion of Iraq, ostensibly in search of non-existent weapons of mass destruction, is frequently characterized as a political aberration based on a failure of intelligence coupled with the most idealistic of intentions. The expanding U.S. empire is openly exhibited as a source of pride for Americans, who are offered no serious understanding of the consequences, or only how this is viewed by the rest of the world. It is not the purpose of this small book to provide an explanation for these failures of comprehension. Rather, my intent is to show that an entirely different approach, rooted in the critique of imperialism and emanating from Marxist and radical left thought generally, offers a much more consistent, powerful, and revealing perspective on these historical developments. In order to demonstrate this as concretely as possible, I have followed the lead of Leo Huberman, Paul Sweezy, and Harry Magdalf in their classic account, Vietnam, The Endless War, by deliberately avoiding in this book all argument from hindsight. The 13 chapters here consist of editorial statements published in Monthly Review beginning in November 2001 and ending in January 2005. In addition, an introduction written in the preparation of this book and published in Monthly Review in September 2005 is included here. No changes of substance beyond technical editing have been introduced in any of the 13 chapters. All of the essays that compose this volume were written in direct response to the developing course of U.S. imperialism since September 2001, usually timed in relation to specific events. Since the chapters are arranged chronologically, a story unfolds throughout the book. Although the argument builds, it does so in response to rapid historical changes, many of which constituted turning points. Unfortunately, the emerging global tragedy already clearly pointed to in the last chapter is played out in the chapters that follow. None of this was truly inevitable. As potential agents of history, we have the ability to act. A concerted global resistance, in which protest within the United States itself is crucial, can stop this process in its tracks. A message conveyed in one way or another at the end of nearly every chapter. All the essays in this book, with the exception only The Empire of Barbarism, co-authored with Brett Clerl, were either written solely by me or were drafted primarily by me and co-authored with my Mont/LLY review co-écriteurs, Harry Magdlali and Robert W. McEltesney. To Harry and Bob I owe everything. This book is in point one very real sense theirs as well as mine. Others also read and gave input in the construction of all of these essays, including John May Jones-Simon, Michael Yates, Claude Misukios, Victor Wallace, Fred Magdal, and Brett Clark. There is not a chapter here that does not reflect the feedback of these Indy 6. The possibility of a full-scale U.S. military intervention in the Middle East was opened up. This occurred almost immediately with the Cold War, commencing in the spring of 1991. The United States, although aware in advance of the impending Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, did not strongly oppose it until after it had taken place. The Iraqi invasion offered the United States a pretext for a full-scale war in the Middle East. Between 100,000 and 200,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed in the Gulf War, and at least 15,000 Iraqi civilians died directly from U.S. and British bombing of Iraq. Commenting on what he believed was one of the chief gains of the war, President Bush declared in April 1991, "By God, we've licked the Vietnam syndrome." Nevertheless, the United States at the time chose not to pursue its advantage and invade and occupy Iraq. Although there were undoubtedly numerous reasons for that decision, including the fact that it would probably not have been supported by the Arab members of the Gulf War coalition, the primary one was the geopolitical shift resulting from the collapse of the Soviet bloc. By then the Soviet Union itself was tottering. Uncertainty about the future of the Soviet Union and the geopolitical sphere it had controlled was such that Washington could not then afford the commitment of troops that a continuing occupation of Iraq would have entailed. The end of the Soviet Union came only months later. During the remainder of the 1990s, the United States was to engage in major military interventions in the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and Eastern Europe. This culminated in 1999 with the war in Yugoslavia, in which the United States, leading NATO, bombed for 11 weeks, followed by the insertion of NATO ground troops. Purportedly carried out to stop ethnic cleansing, the war in the Balkans was geopolitically about the extension of U.S. imperial power into an area formerly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Already by the close of the 20th century, the power elite in the United States had therefore moved toward a policy of naked imperialism to a degree not seen since the opening years of the century, with the U.S. empire now conceived as planetary in scope. Even as a massive anti-globalization movement was emergency. Notably with the Seattle protests in November 1999, the U.S. establishment was moving energetically toward an imperialism for the 21st century, one that would promote neoliberal globalization while resting on U.S. world dominance. The hidden hand of the market. Thomas Friedman, the LN-Lit/.ER prize-winning new YNRL Artin columnist, opined, "Will never work without a hidden list. McDonald's cannot flourish without a McDonnell Douglas, the builder of the F-15. And the hidden list that keeps the world sail for Silicon Valley's technologies is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine. Sure, the shift toward a more openly militaristic imperialism occurred only gradually, in stages. For most of the 1990s, the U.S. ruling class and national security establishment had waged a debate behind the scenes on what to do now that the Soviet Union's disappearance had left the United States as the sole superpower. Naturally, there was never any doubt about what was to be the main economic thrust of global empire ruled over by the United States. The 1990s saw the strengthening of neoliberal the removal of barriers to capital throughout the world in ways that directly enhance the power of the rich capitalist countries at the center of the world economy vis-a-vis the poor countries of the periphery. A key development was the introduction of the World Trade Organization to accompany the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as organizations enforcing the monopoly capitalist rules of the game. From the standpoint of most of the world, a more exploitative economic imperialism had raised its ugly head. Yet for the powers that be at the center of the world economy, neoliberal globalization was regarded as a resounding success, notwithstanding signs of global financial instability as revealed by the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98. U.S. ruling circles continued to debate, however, the manner and extent to which the United States should push its ultimate advantage and use its vast military power as a means of promoting U.S. global supremacy in the new unipolar world. If neoliberalism had arisen in response to economic stagnation, transferring the costs of economic crisis to the world's poor, the problem of declining U.S. economic hegemony tended to require an altogether different response. The reassertion ahead is at stake today is not the control of a particular part of planet no matter how large, putting at a disadvantage but still tolerating the independent actions of some rivals, but the control of its totality by one hegemonic economic and military superpower, with all means, even the most extreme authoritarian and, if needed, violent military ones at its disposal. The unprecedented dangers of this new global disorder are revealed in the twin cataclysms to which the world is heading at present: nuclear proliferation and hence increased chances of the outbreak of nuclear war, and planetary ecological destruction. These are symbolized by the Bush administration's refusal to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to limit nuclear weapons development, and Robert McNamara stated, "The United States has never endorsed the policy of no first use, not during my 7 years as Secretary or since. We have been and remain prepared to initiate the use of nuclear weapons by the decision of own person, the President, against either a nuclear or non-nuclear enemy whenever we believe it is in our interest to do so. The nation with the greatest conventional military force and the willingness to use it unilaterally to enlarge its global power is also the nation with the greatest nuclear force and the readiness to use it whenever it sees lit setting the whole world on edge. The nation that contributes more to carbon dioxide emissions leading to global warming than any other has become the greatest obstacle to addressing global warming and the world's growing environmental problems, raising the possibility of the collapse of civilization itself if present trends continue. The United States is seeking to exercise sovereign authority over the planet during a life-threatening global crisis, economic stagnation, increasing polarization between the global rich and the global poor, weakening U.S. economic hegemony, growing nuclear threats, and deepening ecological decline. The result is a heightening of international instability. Other potential forces are emerging in the world, such as the European Community and China, which could eventually challenge U.S. power, regionally and even globally. Third world revolutions, far from ceasing, are beginning to gain momentum again, exemplified by Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution under Hugo Chavez. U.S. attempts to tighten its imperial grip on the Middle East and its oil have had to cope with a fierce, seemingly unstoppable, Iraqi resistance, generating conditions of imperial overstretch. With the United States brandishing its nuclear arsenal and refusing to support international agreements on the control of such weapons, insofar as they limit its own power, nuclear proliferation is continuing. New nations, such as North Korea, are entering or can be expected soon to enter the nuclear club. Terrorist blowback from imperialist wars in the Third World is now a well-recognized reality, generating rising fear of further terrorist attacks in New York, London, and elsewhere. Such vast and overlapping historical contradictions, rooted in the combined and uneven development of the global capitalist economy along with the U.S. drive for planetary domination, foreshadow what is potentially the most dangerous period in the history of imperialism. The course on which U.S. and world capitalism is now headed points to global barbarism or worse. Yet it is important to remember that nothing in the development of human history is inevitable. There still remains an alternative path: the global struggle for a humane, egalitarian, democratic, and sustainable society. The classic name for such a society is socialism. Such a renewed struggle for a world of substantive human equality must begin by addressing the system's weakest link and at the same time the world's most pressing why organizing a global resistance movement against the new naked imperialism. The war on terrorism. Here is little we can say directly about the September 11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in VL/Ashington, D.C. except that these were acts of utter, inhuman violence, indefensible in every sense, taking a deep and lasting human toll. Such terrorism has to be rid from the face of earth. The difficulty lies in how to accomplish this. Terrorism generates counter-terrorism, and the United States has long been a party to this deadly game, as perpetrator more often than victim. The U.S. strategy of retaliation in the form of a global war on terrorism already commencing on October 7 with military strikes in Afghanistan is certain to compound this tragedy in the months and years ahead. For this reason it is now more important than ever that the realities of U.S. militarism and imperialism be brought to light, along with the role of propaganda in removing them from the scrutiny of domestic population. That the United States is the dominant global empire, the modern Rome, is crystal clear. Since the 19,405, if not earlier, the United States has been engaged in a struggle to maintain and even expand its position as the world's foremost nihilitary economic and political power. Today the United States accounts for about a third of all world military expenditures. LT is the world's leading international arms seller. And it has rained death and destruction on more people in more regions of the globe than any other nation in the period since the Second World War. Consider the following. The United States has employed its military forces in other countries over 70 times since 1945, not counting immeasurable instances of counterinsurgency operations by the CIA. In the Middle East/Islamic world alone, over the last 20 years the U.S. military shot down Libyan jets in 1981, sent military personnel and equipment to the Sinai as part of a multinational force in 1982, sent Marines to Lebanon in 1982. Dispatched an AWACS electronic surveillance plane directed against Libya to Egypt in 1983, used a WACS electronic surveillance aircraft to aid Saudi Arabia in shooting down Iranian jets in the Persian Gulf in 1984, fired missiles at and bombed Libya in 1986, shot down Libyan Gders in 1989, escorted Kuwaiti oil tankers during the Iraq-Iran War, fought the Gulf War against Iraq in 1991, read missiles and carried out bombing strikes against Iraq on numerous occasions in the last decade, carried out military exercises in Kuwait in 1992, deployed its armed forces in Somalia in 1992, demolished one of the few Pharmaceutica.L plants in Sudan in a missile attack in 1998. Fired 60 cruise missiles equipped with cluster bombs at Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan in 1998. Commenced war operations in Afghanistan in 2001. More than 100,000 Iraqi civilians were killed in the Gulf War and as many as 500,000 children have died as a result of U.S. imposed sanctions since the war. U.S. support for Israel in the form of billions of dollars of military aid each year coupled with its refusal to rein in Israel's territorial ambitions have made it a principal party to the war of terror inflicted on the Palestinian people. What explains this imperialist thrust? U.S. capitalism has been dependent since the Second World War on large infusions of military spending both to support its imperial interests abroad and to prop up the economy. In this respect the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union had negative as well as positive consequences for the U.S. ruling class. How was the huge military budget of hundreds of billions of dollars a year adjusted with the disappearance of the evil empire? Tied up with this were the growing challenges to U.S. economic power from rival capitalist states, which during the Cold War period had generally submitted to U.S. interests within the context of the broad Cold War alliance. In the years that have intervened since the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. ruling class has thus been seeking a substitute for the Cold War with which to justify its imperial designs. Various alternatives have been offered: a war on terrorism, the struggle against rogue states, a clash of civilizations, a war on the global drug trade, and humanitarian intervention, all of them up to now seen as unsatisfactory, but sufficient to keep the military budget from shrinking drastically after the Cold War. Fortunately, a godsend appeared in the form of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. But the rapid victory over Iraqi forces in the Gulf War was so complete and so devastating that Hussein could no longer serve as the credible threat needed to justify U.S. worldwide military commitments. As General Colin Powell voiced the problem in 1991, think hard about it. I'm running out of demons. I'm running out of villains. There is no doubt that this was viewed as an insoluble dilemma within the COR riders of power in the United States. Only weeks ago, at this writing, it looked like President Bush's proposal to expand U.S. military spending through the creation of an anti-missile defense system was going to have some still opposition in Congress, although most of the Bush program would no doubt have been adopted in the end, since both Republican and Democratic parties have continually supported increasing military expenditures. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon have now changed all of that. The United States is gearing up for what is being touted as the worst war of millennium. For a Wall Street suffering from economy stagnation and growing uncertainty, the one bit of really good news is the skyrocketing virtually overnight of U.S. military expenditures, with more increases to be expected in the very near future, sending the stocks of military contractors soaring. Notwithstanding shock and horror associated with the terrorist attacks, the U.S. Niling class was quick enough to grasp this as an Il-98 opportunity for a new global military crusade of a scope approximating that of Cold War, hence it wasted no time in fanning the flames of war. The militaristic response was cast in stone before the North Tower of the World Trade Center fell to the earth. In President Bush's major speech to the nation on September 20, 2001, he indicted Osama bin Laden and his terrorist network for the attacks and issued threats to the Taliban government in /Afghanistan, indicating that they too were a target for having harbored the enemy. But he did not stop there. He also declared that there are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists. From this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. The United States was entering into a lengthy campaign unlike any we have seen, which would include dramatic military strikes and covert actions. Ground troops would be committed and losses could be expected. The United States would utilize every necessary weapon of war against these enemies. "COD," Bush exclaimed, "is not neutral," evoking familiar Christian notion of divine retribution against sinners. But behind this speech is a still more frightening reality. Congress, with only one dissenter, has turned over to the president the power not only to conduct this ill-deemed war as he pleases but also to define the enemy itself, which is already being projected as of worldwide scope. A war is to be fought, Bush and his administration made clear, and it is to take place in many different countries extending to whole nations. Yet, the U.S. public is still left in the dark as to who these additional enemies are outside of Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, or where the U.S. military will choose to strike next after Afghanistan. Bush's speech thus establishes the basis for a series of military interventions without definite geographical boundaries or moral restraints on the weapons to be used, and without any limits on the numbers or types of enemies to be encountered. On top of these is a plan for greatly expanded federal powers for the maintenance of internal security, including the creation of a cabinet-level Office of Homeland Security. It is possible that given time the U.S. ruling class will split over some oldly-esque issues, the extent old militarizati 0n_ the immigrant countries that will he target ed in this war, and the infringements on the freedom of U.S. citizens. There will probably be pressure from allied nat.ions to temper the militarism. But these are questions of degree. The U.S. power elite appears solidly behind a global expansion of U.S. military role and severe global retaliation lure the attacks. There can be no dual, that the world is lacing Władysław Mazaros in his S0 NUT last, even within the left, by the concept of globalization, suggesting that some of the worst forms of international exploitation and rivalry had somehow abetted. A growing fashion on the left in the treatment of globalization, one equally attractive to ruling circles judging by the attention given it by the mass media, is exemplified in a new book by Michael Eilard and Antonio Negri, entitled E1N. In this sense, the Gulf War did indeed, as George Bush claimed, announce the birth of a new world order. Empire, the name they give to this new world order, is a product offspring GLC over sovereignty and production and its control, production and consumption, competition and monopoly, development and underdevelopment, world economic expansion and intercapitalist rivalry, accumulation and crisis, production and destruction, the domination of labor and dependence on labor, employment and unemployment, and growth of output at all costs and environmental destruction. It is quite inconceivable to overcome even a single one of these contradictions. Observes, let alone their inextricably combined network, without instituting a radical alternative to Capita's mode of social metabolic control. According to this analysis, the period of capitalism's historic ascendance has now ended. Capitalism has expanded throughout the globe, but in most of the world it has produced only enclaves of capital. There is no longer any promise of the underdeveloped world as a whole catching up economically with the advanced capitalist countries, or even of sustained economic and social advance in most of the periphery. Living conditions of the vast majority of workers are declining globally. The long structural crisis of the system, since the 1970s, prevents capital from effectively coping with its contradictions, even temporarily. The extraneous help offered by the state is no longer sufficient to boost the system. Hence, capital's destructive uncontrollability, its destruction of previous social relations, and its inability to put anything sustainable in their place is coming more and more to the fore. At the core of Mazaros' argument is the proposition that we are now living within what is the potentially deadliest phase of imperialism. Imperialism, he says, can be divided into three distinct historical phases: early modern colonialism, the classic phase of imperialism as depicted by Lenin, and global hegemonic imperialism, with the U.S. its dominant force. The third phase was consolidated following the Second World War, but it became sharply pronounced with the onset of capital structural crisis in the 1905. Unlike most analysts, Mazaros argues that U.S. hegemony did not end in the 1905, though by 1970 the U.S. had suffered a decline in its relative economic position vis the other leading capitalist states when compared with the 1905. Rather, the 1970s, starting with Nixon's abandonment of the dollar-gold standard, marked the beginning of a much more determined effort on the part of the U.S. state to establish its global preeminence in economic, military, and political terms to constitute itself as a surrogate global government. At the present stage of the global development of capital, Mazaros insists, it is no longer possible to avoid facing up to a fundamental contradiction and structural limitation of the system. That limitation is its grave failure to constitute the state of the capital system as such, as complementary to its transnational aspirations and articulation. Thus it is here that the United States, dangerously bent on assuming the role of the state of the capital system as such, subsuming under itself by all means at its disposal all rival powers, enters in, as the closest thing to a state of the capital system. But the United States, while able to bring a halt to the decline in its economic position relative to the other leading capitalist states, has been unable to achieve sufficient economic dominance by itself to govern the world system, which is, in any case, ungovernable. It therefore seeks to utilize its immense military power to establish its global preeminence. What is at stake to stance? With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, it has become necessary for imperialism to take on new clothes. The old Cold War justification for interventions no longer works. Saddam Hussein, Mazaros observes, provided such a new justification, but only temporarily. Even then the United States was compelled to present its war malting in the guise of a universal alliance in the interest all global right, albeit with the United States acting the part of both judge and executioner. Among the disquieting developments that point 5 Uri2.vunra-llmmri.sm points to are, the enormous toll in Iraqi civilian casualties during the Gulf War and the death of more than 500,000 children as a result of sanctions since the war, the military onslaught on and occupation of Balkans, the expansion of NATO to the east, the new U.S. policy of employing NATO as an offensive military force that can substitute for the United Nations, U.S. attempts to further circumvent and undermine the United Nations, the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the development of THIRD-WORLDISM security treaty aimed at China, and the growth of an aggressive U.S. military stance with regard to China increasingly seen as the emerging rival superpower. Over the longer run, even the present apparent harmony between the United States and the European Union cannot be taken for granted, as the United States continues to pursue its quest for global domination. Nor is there an answer to this problem within the system at this stage in the development of capital. Globalization, Mazaros argues, has made a global state imperative for capital, but the inherent character of capital's social metabolism process, which demands a plurality of capitals, makes this impossible. The potentially deadliest phase of imperialism thus has to do with the expanding circle of barbarism and destruction that such conditions are bound to produce. How do these two views of globalization/imperialism, the increasingly fashionable one focusing on the emergence of global sovereignty and the decidedly unfashionable view pointing to the potentially deadliest phase of imperialism, look today following the events of September 11 and the commencement in Afghanistan of a global war on terrorism? It might perhaps be argued that the analysis of M1 is confirmed, since it was not a nation-state that offered a challenge to the emerging system of global sovereignty but international terrorists outside the empire. In this view, the United States could be seen as carrying out a world police action in Afghanistan not as a function of its own national motives but in the name of global right, as Hart and Negri described the U.S. actions in the Gulf War. This is more or less the way Washington describes its own actions. Socialism or barbarism, however, would appear to suggest an altogether different interpretation, one that sees U.S. imperialism as central to the terror crisis. In this view, the terrorists attacking the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were not attacking global sovereignty or civilization, much less the values of freedom and democracy as claimed by the U.S. state, but were deliberately targeting the symbols of U.S. lineage and become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. Gone, spirited away by eclipses, were Marx and Engels' allusions in the same passage to the bourgeois epoch and their subsequent reference to how the need for a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It is no doubt largely in response to this atmosphere of inevitability, in which globalization is divorced from all agency, that the movement against the neoliberal global project has chosen to exaggerate the role of the visible instruments of globalization at the expense of any serious consideration of historical capitalism. Radical dissenters frequently single out the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and multinational corporations and even specific corporations like McDonald's for criticism, while de-emphasizing the system and its seemingly inexorable forces. These two distorted viewpoints, one generally in support of globalization, the other generally opposed, are mutually reinforcing in their unreality. Those who wish to intervene in these processes are thus left with no real material basis on which to ground their actions. Both perspectives have in common an emphasis on the decline of nation-state sovereignty. Adam Smith described capitalism in the late 18th century as a system that eliminated all need for a sovereign power in the economic realm, replacing the visible hand of the absolutist or mercantilist state with the invisible hand of the market. The sovereign, he wrote, is completely discharged from a duty with respect to the market. Now we are told that this invisible hand has been globalized to such an extent that the sovereign power of nation-states over their territorial domains themselves has been vastly diminutivized. For new YBR/T Times Foreign Affairs columnist Thomas Friedman, author of the Lexus and the Olive Tree. Globalization is a new technological economic system based in the microchip and ruled by an electronic herd of financial investors and multinational corporations, free from any nation-state or power structure, and beholden to none. Those seeking to dispel such views might reply that capitalism with all of its contradictions remains. But most current conceptions of capitalism are too lacking in historical specificity and concreteness, and too wrapped up in the notion of unfettered competition, to be useful in countering this dominant ideology. Indeed, the very idea of capitalism is being shorn of all determinate elements. The notion of global free market hegemony without the nation-state and without discernible centers of power means a concept of capitalism that has become virtually synonymous with globalization. There is it is proclaimed no alternative bektunsi. There is nothing outside the system, and no center within the system. The ideological fog that pervades all aspects of the globalization debate is bound to dissipate eventually, as it becomes clear that the contradictions ol capitalism, which have never been surmounted, are present in more universal and more destructive fortune than ever before. For those seeking to penetrate this fog at present and to understand the constellation of forces LLL the W0RLI_V_1/I.V/M/0/I_, the latest phase of capitalism was soon followed by Lenin's imperialism, the I-lights stage of capitalism. Hilferding pointed to the tendency of concentration and centralization of capital to generate a greater and greater consolidation of capital, pointing eventually to one big cartel, an overly simplistic view that failed to perceive some of the countervailing influences at work. He saw these changes as mainly quantitative in character, and though his work was full of important insights, he did not explore the question of qualitative alterations in the laws of motion of capitalism. Hilferding's perspective did, however, inspire Lenin to connect imperialism with the monopoly stage of capitalism, and to perceive the growth of giant capital therefore as integrally related to both the expansion of capital on the world stage, and the struggle between nation-states for shares of the world market. But Lenin, like Hilferding before him, did not pursue the question of how capitalism's basic laws of motion might be moded in the monopoly stage. The concept of monopoly capitalism was to remain axiomatic for Soviet economists in the 1920s and 1930s, during which some important new departures were begun. But by the late 1930s it had been reduced to a mere dogma within the rigid orthodoxy that prevailed under Stalinism. In the 19,308 in the West, meanwhile, mainstream academic economists, particularly Joan Robinson, Edward Chamberlain, and the young Paul Sweezy, finally began to deal with monopoly. Yet the theory of imperfect competition that was to emerge from their analyses had a phonal character that was usually divorced from real historical processes. Nor was it intended as more than a minor qualification to the theory of perfect competition, which continued to be considered the general rule, and prevailed over economics as a whole. By the 19,305 Marxian economics could be said to have three strands: the theory of capital accumulation and crisis, the beginnings zero, a theory of monopoly capitalism, and the theory of imperialism. The second and third strands, growing monopolization and imperialism, and that the stagnation was worsened by the growth of giant corporations with a large degree of monopoly power. One of the objects of the temporary National Economic Committee established by the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression was to investigate this question. Yet, despite all of this, own Maynard Keynes' general Theo-economics, IOE1N.Ent/1I.THIRD-JT and money, which trailbriaed macroeconomics in response to the Depression, remained root. In this way, Kalecki was able to link monopoly power to the distribution of national income, and to the sources of economic crisis and stagnation. Kalecki also explored the more general historical conditions eating investment. In the closing paragraphs of his theory of economic dynamics he concluded, long-run development is not inherent in the capitalist economy. Thus specific developmental factors are required to sustain a long-run upward movement. This analysis was carried forward by Joseph Steindl, a young Austrian economist who had worked closely with Calicalti in England. According to Steindel's Maturity and Stagram in American Capitalism, giant corporations tended to promote widening profit margins but were constantly threatened by a shortage of effective demand, due to the uneven distribution of income and resulting weakness of wage-based consumption. New investment could conceivably pick up the slack. Yet such investment resulted in new productive capacity, that is, an enlargement of the potential supply of goods. The tragedy of investment, Calicalti wrote, is that it is use.il. Giant RMS, able to control to a considerable extent their levels of price, output, and investment, would not invest if large portions of their existing productive capacity were already standing idle. Confronted with a downward shift in null demand, monopolistic or oligopolistic RMS would not lower prices but would instead rely almost exclusively on cutbacks in output, capacity utilization, and new investment. In this way they would maintain, to whatever extent possible, existing prices and prevailing profit margins. The giant RM under monopoly capitalism was thus prone to wider profit margins and larger amounts of excess capacity than was the case for a freely competitive system, thereby generating a strong tendency toward economic stagnation. The appearance in 1942 of Paul Sweezy's classic study The T/IQ/I Cent. The answer, he suggested, was to be found in the way in which capitalism was brought to these regions during the period of what Marx called primitive accumulation, characterized by undisguised looting, enslavement and murder, and in the way in which this very process has served to smother fledgling industries in the colonized societies. LT was thus the European conquest and plundering of the rest of the globe that generated the great divide between the core and periphery of the capitalist world economy that persists to this day. In illustrating this, Barron highlighted the different ways in which India and Japan were incorporated into the world economy as a result of the globalizing tendencies of capitalism, the first as a dependent social phonation carrying the unfortunate legacy of what André Kunder-Frank was later to call the development of underdevelopment, the second representing the exceptional case of a society that was neither colonized nor subject for long to unequal treaties, and that, retaining control over its own economic surplus, was free to develop along the autocentric lilies of the core European powers. The implication of this analysis was clear: incorporation on an unequal basis into the periphery of capitalist world economy is itself the main cause of the plight of the underdeveloped countries. For Barron, imperialism, in this sense, was inseparable from capitalism. Picture of the world developed by monopoly capital theory. This generated an approach to the latest phase of globalization entirely different from those most commonly encountered today. National sovereignty in the center of the system, according to the perspective of monopoly capital theory, was not eroded. The world economy was seen neither as chaotic, in the sense of a lack of powerful organizing forces, nor, as some contended, as giving rise to a new international of capital led by the WTO and other supranational organizations. For the sake of perspective, Magdolf explained in his treatise, Globalisation, growing rivalry between the United States, Europe, and Japan, increasing concern within U.S. ruling circles about the potential threat represented by China, viewed as an emerging superpower rival, and aggressive U.S. attempts to preempt such challenges by extending the geopolitical sphere of its hegemony. To all the talk about globalization having integrated the world and disintegrated all centers, eliminating all sovereign powers, is largely illusion. Nation-state sovereignty and U.S. imperialism have not gone away but continue to exist in this new phase ola capitalisal globali in an explosive mixture. Globalization ola capital in the present stage of capitalism is thus inseparable from increasing monopolization, that is, the concentration and centralization of capital on a world scale /vh necessarily produces bigger contradictions and crises. The three most important underlying trends in the recent history of capitalism underscore the period beginning with the recession of 1974-75, Sweezy argued in mid/Tly Revinzu in 1997, were, the slowing down of the overall rate of growth, the worldwide proliferation of monopolistic multinational corporations, and what may be become just as much a part of the Roman Empire as the less extensive territories of Lodbili Earthquake increases during the Vietnam War. Only alter the Vietnam War did the number of U.S. overseas base sites begin to loll once again. By 1988, these bases numbered slightly less than at the end of the Korean War, but reflect a very different global pattern than at the beginning of the post-Second World War period, with the sharpest declines in South Asia and Middle East/Africa. 1947 I-949 1953 1957 I-967 I-975 I-988 Europe Canado, and North Atlantic 506 253 446 566 673 633 627. Pacific and Southeast Asia 343 235 29 L 256 271 183 I-21. Latin America and the Caribbean I-1359 646 55 40 39. Middle East and Ulrico 7423 L7 L5 L597. South Asia H33 200000. Total LL 39 532 315 833 L0 L4B 65 794. Source, James R. Blocker, United States Overseas Basing, Table I-2. Historically, bases have often been acquired during wars. For example, the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo, Cuba, was obtained in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. Although that base is technically leased, the lease is permanent. According to the treaty, U.S. jurisdiction over the base can be terminated only by the mutual consent of both Cuba and the United States as long as nominal annual payments are made giving the United States rights to this part of Cuba in perpetuity, regardless of views of the Cuban government and PEOPLE. Since the Cul and Revolution, the checks issued on behalf of the United States to pay for the leasing of base have been cashed only once. All subsequent checks have simply been held by Cuba, without being cashed, in line with Cuba's demand that the base be removed from its territory. Many current U.S. bases were acquired in subsequent wars: the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the war in Afghanistan. U.S. military bases in Okinawa, formerly part of Japan, are a legacy of the U.S. occupation of Japan during the Second World War. Like all empires, the United States has been extremely reluctant to relinquish any base once acquired. Bases obtained in one war are seen as forward deployment positions for some future war, often involving an entirely new enemy. According to a December 21, 1970, report issued by the Subcommittee on Security Agreements and Commitments Abroad, U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Once an American overseas base is established, it takes on a life of its own. Original missions may become outdated, but new missions are developed, not only with the intention of keeping the facility going, but often to actually enlarge it. Within the government departments most directly concerned, state and defense, we found little initiative to reduce or eliminate any of these overseas facilities. In the 1950s and 19,605, the United States articulated a specific doctrine of strategic denial that argued that no withdrawal should be made from any base that could potentially be acquired thereafter by the Soviet Union. The majority of U.S. bases were justified as ringing and containing communism. Yet, upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States sought to retain its entire basing system on the grounds that this was necessary for the global projection of its power and the protection of U.S. interests abroad. Glasnost and perestroika in the late 1980s, followed by the collapse of Soviet-dominated regimes in Eastern Europe in 1989 and the demise of the Soviet Union itself in 1991, generated a strong expectation, particularly among those who had swallowed the claim that U.S. bases were simply there to contain the Soviet threat, that there would be a rapid dismantling of the U.S. basing system. Yet, the Department of Defense insisted in its annual report of the SC Series MIC Defense in 1989 that the power projection of the United States necessitated such forward deployments. 7 On August 2, 1990, President George Herbert Walker Bush issued a statement indicating that, while the U.S. overseas basing system should remain intact, by 1995 U.S. global security requirements might be met by an active force 25% smaller than in 1990. On that same day Iraq invaded Kuwait. The massive introduction of U.S. troops into the Middle East during the Gulf War led to the proclamation of a new world order rooted in U.S. hegemony and U.S. military power. By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all, Bush declared. New military bases in the Middle East were established, notably in Saudi Arabia, where thousands of U.S. troops have been stationed for more than a decade. Although the Clinton administration was to insist more strongly than the Bush administration that preceded it on the need to. 7 Bahama Islands 18. El Salvador 28. Indonesia 8 Bahrain 19. France 29. Italy 9 Belgium 20. Germany 30. Japan 10 Bosnia 21. Greece 31. Johnston Atoll 11 Bulgaria 22. Greenland 32. Korea 33 Kosovo 42. Pakistan 5. Tajikistan 34 Kuwait 43. Peru 52. Turkey 35 Kwajalein Atoll 44. Portugal 53, Egypt 36 Kyrgyzstan 45. Puerto Rico 54. United Kingdom 37 Luxembourg 46. Qatar 55. United States 38 Netherlands 47. Saudi Arabia 56. Uzbekistan 39 New Zealand 48. Singapore 57. Virgin Islands 40 Norway 49. Spain 59. Wake Island 4. Oman 50. St. Helena. And separate Tierney 1 ES. Militar_bases in U.S. territories and possessions outside the Lifty states and the District of Columbia are added, it rises to 44. This number is extremely conservative, however, since it does not include important strategic vulnerable bases, even some OFLOHUs in which the United States maintains substantial numbers of troops, such as Saudi Arabia, Kosovo, and Bosnia. Nor does it include some oft most recently acquired U.S. bases. Through Plan Colombia aimed principally at guerrilla forces in Colombia but also against the less than servile government of Venezuela and the massive popular movement opposing neoliberalism in Ecuador, the United States is now in the process of expanding its base presence in the Latin American and Caribbean region. Puerto Rico has replaced El Anima as the HNL for the region. Meanwhile, the United States has been establishing 4 new military bases in Manta, Ecuador, Aruba, Curacao, and Comalapa, El Salvador, all characterized as forward operating locations. Since September 11, the United States has set up military bases housing 60,000 troops in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, along with Kuwait, Qatar, Turkey, and Bulgaria. Also crucial in the operation is the major U.S. naval base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. All told, the United States now has overseas military bases in almost 60 countries and separate territories. In some ways this number may even be deceptively low. All issues of jurisdiction and authority with respect to bases in host countries are spelled out in what are called status of forces agreements. During the Cold War years these were normally public documents, but are now often classified as secret. For example, those with Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and in certain respects Saudi Arabia. According to Pentagon records, the United States now has formal agreements of this kind with 93 countries. Imperialism abhors a vacuum. Apart from the Balkans and the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, which were previously within the Soviet sphere of influence or part of the Soviet Union itself, The forward bases that are now being acquired are in regions where the United States had experienced drastic reductions in its number of bases. In 1990, prior to the Gulf War, the United States had no bases in South Asia and only 10% as many in the Middle East/Africa as in 1947. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the number of U.S. bases had declined by about two-thirds between 1947 and 1990. From a geopolitical/geomilitary standpoint, this was clearly a problem for a global economic and military hegemon such as the United States, even in the age of long-range cruise missiles. The appearance of new bases in the Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America, and the noted on January 10, 2002, the base at Manas in Kyrgyzstan, where U.S. planes are landing daily, is 250 miles from the western Chinese border. With U.S. bases to the east in Japan, to the south in South Korea, and Washington's military support for Taiwan, China may feel encircled. The projection of U.S. military power into new regions through the establishment of U.S. military bases should not of course be seen simply in terms of direct military ends. They are always used to promote the economic and political objectives of U.S. capitalism. For example, U.S. corporations and the U.S. government have been eager for some time to build a secure corridor for U.S. controlled oil and natural gas pipelines from the Caspian Sea in Central Asia through Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. The war in Afghanistan and the creation of U.S. bases in Central Asia are viewed as a key opportunity to make such pipelines a reality. The principal exponent of this policy has been Unocal Corporation, as indicated by its testimony to the House Committee on International Relations seen February 1998. On December 31, 2001, President George W. Bush appointed Afghan-born Zalmay Khalilzad from the National Security Council to be Special Envoy to Afghanistan. Khalilzad is a former advisor for Unocal in connection with the proposed Trans-Afghan pipeline and lobbied the U.S. government for a more sympathetic policy toward the Taliban regime. He changed his position only after the Clinton administration fired cruise missiles at targets in Afghanistan in 1998. During the present war in Afghanistan, the U.S. media have generally been quiet about U.S. oil ambitions in the region. Nevertheless, an article in the Business section of New KN/R.Times noted that, the State Department is exploring the potent EL for post-Taliban energy projects in the region, which has more than 6% of the world's proven oil reserves and almost 40% of its gas reserves. LN an op-ed piece in the NR2YBRKLI1N.CS, Richard Butler, of the Council on Foreign Relations, acknowledged that, the war in Afghanistan, has made the construction of a pipeline across Afghanistan and Pakistan politically possible for the first time since Unocal and the Argentinian company BRIDES competed for the Afghan rights in the mid-1905. Needless to say, without three strong U.S. military presence in the region, through the establishment of bases as a result of the war, the construction of such a pipeline would almost certainly have proven impracticable. History teaches that foreign military bases are a double-edged sword. The most obvious indication of the truth of this proposition is the present war on terrorism. There can be little doubt that attacks over the last decade or more directed against both U.S. forces abroad and targets in the United States itself have been a response in large part to the growing U.S. role as a foreign military power in regions such as the Middle East, where the United States has not only engaged in military actions, even full-scale war, but also since 1990 has stationed thousands of troops. The establishment of U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia was regarded by some Saudis as an occupation of the holiest land of Islam, to be repelled at virtually any cost. The perception of U.S. military bases as intrusions on national sovereignty is widespread in host countries for the simple reason that the presence of such bases inevitably translates into interference in domestic politics. As the 1970 report by the Subcommittee on Security Agreements and Commitments Abroad of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee noted, overseas bases, the presence of elements of United States Armed Forces, joint planning, joint exercises, or excessive military assistance programs, all but guarantee some involvement by the United States in the internal affairs of the host government. Such countries become more and more enmeshed in the U.S. empire. U.S. Overseas military bases thus frequently give rise to major social protests in the subject countries. Until the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 1992, the U.S. bases in the Philippines were widely regarded in that nation as a legacy of U.S. colonialism. Like nearly all U.S. military bases overseas, they brought with them a host of social problems. The town of Olongapo next to the U.S. base at Subic Bay was devoted entirely to rest and recreation for U.S. troops and to more than 30,000 prostitutes. U.S. bases in Okinawa, which Icatan the hub for the U.S. overseas basing SYS-TEM in the Pacific following the loss all the bases in TLTEL Philippines, exist at odds with the population. According to Chalmers Johnson, the island Okinawa, a prefecture of Japan, is essentially a military colony all the Elentagons, a Inigo Sailbouse where Curtin Berets and the Defense Intelligence Agency, not to mention the Air Force and Marine Corps can do things TLTCY would not dare do in the United States. It is used to project American power throughout Asia in the service as is to exert force against those nations that have sought to break out of the imperial system altogether, or that have attempted to chart an independent course that is perceived as threatening U.S. interests. Without the worldwide dispersion of U.S. military forces in these bases, and without the U.S. predisposition to employ them in its military interventions, it would be impossible to keep many of the more dependent economic territories off periphery from breaking away. U.S. global political, economic, and financial power thus requires the periodic exercise of military power. The other advanced capitalist countries tied into the system have also become reliant on the United States as the main enforcer of the rules of the game. The positioning of U.S. military bases should therefore be judged not as a purely military phenomenon, but as a mapping out of the U.S.-dominated imperial sphere and of its spearheads within the periphery. What is clear at present and bears repeating is that such bases are now being acquired in areas where the United States had previously lost much of its forward presence, such as in South Asia, the Middle East/Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean, or in regions where U.S. bases have not existed previously, such as the Balkans and Central Asia. There can be no doubt, therefore, that the last remaining superpower is presently on a course of imperial expansion, as a means of promoting its political and economic interests. The present war on terrorism, which is in many ways an indirect product of projection of U.S. power, is now being used to justify the further projection of that power. For those who choose to oppose these developments there should be no illusion. The global expansion of military power on the part of the hegemonic state of world capitalism is an integral part of economic globalization. To say no to this foamy of military expansionism is to say no at the same time to capitalist globalization and imperialism and hence to capitalism itself. Our goal is not combating a rival, but maintaining our imperial position and maintaining imperial order. Henry Kissinger opens his "Does America Need a Foreign Policy?" with the words "The U.S. is enjoying a preeminence unrivaled by even the greatest empires in the past." There are rules, however, to this re-engagement with the concepts of empire and imperialism within establishment discourse. The uniquely benevolent motives of the United States must be emphasized. Proponents of new imperialism must carefully convey themselves to the military and political concepts of empire and imperialism. And they must eschew all radical notions that connect imperialism to capitalism and exploitation. The birthplace of notion of economic imperialism, as opposed to imperialism more generally, was the United States a little more than a century ago. In his essay, The Economic Basis of Imperialism, first published in the NNRT/RAM Creolism from Sentiment, but does not lure the name if it means only that the United States shall assert their right to remarkets in all the old countries which are being opened up to the surplus resources of the capitalist countries and thereby given the benefits of modern civilization. Whether this policy carries with it the direct government of groups of whole savage islands may be a subject for argument, but upon the economic side oft question there is but one choice, either to enter by some means upon the competition for the employment of American capital and enterprise in these countries, or to continue the needless duplication of existing means of production and communication, with the glut of unconsumed products, the convulsions followed by trade stagnation, and the steadily declining return upon investments which a negative policy will involve. 5. Conflict among the great powers at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, over the partition of Africa, the Sino-Japanese War, the Spanish-American War, the South African War and the Russo-Japanese War, signaled the rise of a new imperialism, associated with monopoly capitalism, that was qualitatively different from the colonialism that had preceded it. This led to an economic theory of imperialism on the part of the proponents of imperialism, who no longer viewed it as mere sentiment, as emphasized in Conant's analysis. The changes in imperialism also soon gave rise to a more thoroughgoing critical analysis, beginning with John A. Hobson's Classic IMF, Ariely J.M. A study, first published in 1902. Hobson was a leading British critic of Boer War, and out of this developed his critique of imperialism. In a famous chapter of his book entitled The Economic Taproot of Imperialism, Hobson observed, "Every improvement of methods of production, every concentration of ownership and control, seems to accentuate the tendency. As one nation after another enters the machine economy and adopts advanced industrial methods, it becomes more difficult for its manufacturers, merchants, and financiers to dispose profitably of their economic resources. Everywhere appear excessive powers of production, excessive capital in search only investment. It is admitted by all businessmen that the growth of powers of production in their country exceeds the growth in consumption, that more goods can be produced than can be sold at a profit, and that more capital exists than can lend remunerative investment. It is this economic condition of failures that forms the taproot of imperialism." LOL, Sun's work was not socialist. He believed that imperialism was due to the dominancy of certain concentrated economic and financial interests, and that radical reforms that dealt with maldistrol, Ulianofincotny and the needs of domestic economy could bring to an end the imperialist impulse. Yet his work was to take in a much larger significance through the influence it exercised on Marxist analyses of imperialism, which were emerging at this time. The most important of these was Lenin's IIIR was the age of imperialism, an era when the US was securing its hold on the resources and the states of the developing world. There were analytical weaknesses with this anti-imperialism critique, mainly because it didn't explain well why the US was so deeply involved in places of seemingly so little economic consequence, such as South Vietnam. Nor was the Imperial America critique helpful in explaining the idealist side of America's interventionism, the Wilsonian compulsion to bring freedom and democracy to the rest of the world. LFTHE aim was to reform US foreign policy. Criticizing the US as a runaway imperial power just didn't lie either with US policymakers or the public. What did seem to work as a way to filter out the tendencies in US foreign policy that supported repression and military intervention in the Third World was the human rights critique. In this view, the fact that US policymakers, that is, the representatives of the dominant system of power, were not drawn to the concept of imperialism was reason enough to dismiss the concept altogether. After all, did not the United States primarily seek, except for a few lapses here and there, to bring freedom and democracy to the rest of the world? Yet at the very time that this article appeared, the US military was engaged in war operations in Afghanistan, building bases throughout Central Asia, and launching interventions in the Philippines and elsewhere. At the same moment that the notion of the age of imperialism was being criticized on the US left, mainstream pundits and political leaders were extolling a new age of imperialism led by the United States. A more influential left criticism of the notion of imperialism was launched by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri in their book Empire. According to Hart and Negri, imperialism ended with the Vietnam War. The 1991 Gulf War, in which the United States unleashed its military power on Iraq, was, according to these authors, carried out not as a function of own national motives but in the name of global rig/TT. The U.S. World Police acts not in imperialist interest but in imperial interest. In this sense the Gulf War did indeed, as George Bush claimed, announce the birth of a new world order. Elsewhere in their book they declared, the United States does not, and indeed no nation-state can today form the center of an imperialist project. It was precisely this position that denied a relationship between the United States and imperialism in the classical, exploitative sense, but which also saw the extension of U.S. sovereignty and power as reflective of empire and a civilizing imperial role that was emphasized in the unstinting praise of Hart and Negri's book that poured out in such places as the New York Times, Time magazine, the London Observer, and foreign affairs. More recently, Todd Gitlin, a former president of the Students for a Democratic Society and now professor of journalism and sociology at Columbia, wrote in the New Liar/T Times. The American left had its version of unilateralism. Responsibility for the attacks had, somehow, to lie with American imperialism, because all responsibility has to lie with American imperialism, a perfect echo of the right's idea that all good powers are and should be somehow American. Intellectuals and activists in the far left could not be troubled much with compassion or defense. Knowing little about Al-Qaeda, they filed it under anti-imperialism, and American attacks on the Taliban under Vietnam quagmire. For them, not ying the flag becoming urgent cause. Post-Vietnam liberals have an opening now. Frida for 60s, Evklo 1 Neno 1L that reached the same conclusion based on UN-organized data. What is wrong with the claims of COMSLO zero relations? The result is that 2.5 billion, CUPLA have seen their standards Olivan LP. Rise to /1 IR tilde hose old billion people in the already developed countries tlitreing global poverty and increasing global equality. From the point of view of individuals, economic liberalization has been one huge success. But what examples? Let us look at India's contribution to the decrease in global poverty. According to the latest World Bank report, 86 FM Profloertler Frapens all L, lower TE the culmination of a plan L 0 years or more in the making, carried out by those who believe that the United States must seize the opportunity for global domination, even if it means becoming the /Mencane imperialists that our enemies always claimed we were. Rome did not stoop to containment, it conquered. And so should we. Wars of imperial expansion, however unjustifiable they may be, always demand some kind of justification. Often this has been accomplished through the doctrine of defensive war. In his 1919 essay, The Sociology of Imperialisms, Joseph Schumpeter wrote of Rome during its years of greatest expansion. There was no Comer oft-known world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. LFTHE interests were not Roman, they were those of Rome's allies, and if Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why, then it was the national honor that had been insulted. The GHT was always invested with an aura of legally. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors, always getting for a breathing space. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their indubitably aggressive designs. The pretense that an endless series of defensive wars was needed to check evil-minded forces bent on aggression in every corner of known world did not die with the Roman Empire, but was part of the rationale for the expansion of British imperialism in the 19th century and American imperialism in the 20th. This same mentality pervades the new national security strategy of the United States, recently transmitted from the executive branch to Congress. This document establishes three key principles of U.S. strategic policy: the perpetuation of unrivaled U.S. global military dominance, so that no nation will be allowed to rival or threaten the United States, U.S. readiness to engage in preemptive military attacks against states or forces anywhere on the globe that are considered a threat to the security zero, the United States, its forces and installations abroad, or its friends or allies, and the entity OLU.S citizens to prosecution by the International Criminal Court. Commenting on this new Nalenmilsum Travai /Rnlegv, Senator Edward M. Kennedy declared, "The administration's doctrine is a call for 21st century American imperialism that no other nation can or should accept. Washington's ambition to establish a global empire beyond anything the world has yet seen is matched only by its paranoid fear of inunderable enemies lurking in every pocket of the globe ready to threaten the security of the homeland itself. These external threats only serve to justify, in its eyes, the extension of U.S. power. The targeted enemies of the United States at present are conveniently located in the Third World, where the possibilities for outright expansion of U.S. imperialism are greatest. Iraq under the brutal dictatorship of Saddam Hussein is presented as the foremost rogue state, global enemy number one. Although Iraq is not yet armed with the most feared weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, it is claimed by the Bush administration that it may soon obtain them. Moreover, because of the purported utter madness of its leader, Iraq is said to be so irrational as to be immune to nuclear deterrence. As a result, there is no choice, we are told, but to strike this evil regime quickly, even before it obtains the feared weapons. The UN inspection process is largely useless at this stage, the Bush administration has insisted. Saddam Hussein, it is contended, will always find a way to hide his most critical weapons operations somewhere in the extensive complexes dedicated to his personal security, which will not be opened fully to UN inspectors, however much Iraq may agree to unconditional inspections. There is no real choice then but regime change through exercise of force, either be military coup or invasion. It is by instilling fear in this way in an American public already primed by the events of September 2001 that the administration has sought to pull the country and the world toward war. If a U.S. president and his administration can stand up day after day and insist that the United States is vulnerable to an imminent attack by weapons of mass destruction, a large part of the population is bound to be carried along. The ceaseless repetition of these dire warnings under something like the big lie principle, coupled with the echo chamber provided by the mass media, gradually wears away popular skepticism. Public support is weak at the outset. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld has written with respect to convincing the population to back an unpopular war, then the U.S. leadership must be willing to invest the political capital to marshal support to sustain the alert for whatever period of time may be required. So crazed have been the claims emanating from the Oval Office, in its alerts to concoct the murkst shreds of a justification for an invasion, that none other than CIA Director George Tenet has been compelled to step out and challenge the false assertions of the president. Thus Tenet has openly contradicted the president's claim that Iraq constitutes an immediate nuclear threat to the United States, pointing out that it would take Iraq until the second half of the decade at the very least to produce enough fissile material for a single nuclear weapon. The administration has attempted to get around the weakness of its case with respect to nuclear weapons by placing more emphasis on the chemical and biological weapons threats of Iraq. In a speech delivered in Cincinnati on October 7, 2002, the president said that Baghdad might attempt at any time to attack targets in the United States with these weapons if aided and abetted by terrorist networks in delivering the weapons to their targets. Yet the CIA, in a letter to Congress signed by Tenet that same day, contradicted such an assessment, arguing that Iraq shows no signs of developing chemical and biological weapons except for purposes of deterrence and that it could be expected to refrain from sponsoring terrorist attacks in the foreseeable future if the United States does not attack it first. Baghdad for now appears to be drawing a line short of conducting terrorist attacks with conventional or CBW against the United States, the letter read. However, should Saddam conclude that a U.S.-led attack could no longer be deterred, the letter continued, he probably would become much less constrained in adopting terrorist actions. The fact is that Iraq today probably does not possess functional chemical and biological war capabilities since these were electively destroyed during the UN inspection process in 1991 to 1998. Its earlier capabilities in this respect date back to the 1980s when Iraq under Saddam Hussein was an ally of the United States. During 1985 to 1989, overlapping with the Iraq-Iran War of 1980 to 1988, and Air. IMKIS I-451 QFR/TRRIR/1/MM/Muse against Iran in 1984, U.S. companies, with the approval of the Reagan and the first Bush administrations, sent numerous fatal biological cultures, including anthrax, to Iraq. 8 shipments of cultures were approved by the Department of Commerce that were later classified by the Centers for Disease Control as having biological warfare significance. Altogether, Iraq received at least 72 shipments of clones, germs, and chemicals with chemical and biological warfare potential fraught on the U.S. in these years. The United States continued to ship such TS to Lilith them. YI 9/::KLI, L/ILFILL/L./ For example, in December 2001, 2 months after the September 11 attacks, President Bush shocked the international community by killing the proposed enforcement and verification mechanism for the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention on the spurious grounds that if biological weapons inspections were to be carried out in the United States, they could threaten the technological secrets and prots of U.S.L.I.O. tech companies. Washington's objectives in Iraq in the years following the Gulf War were inconsistent with the UN inspection and disarmament process, which was aimed at ridding that country of weapons of mass destruction. According to Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector in Iraq in 1991 to 1998, this was evident through U.S. unilateral subversion of the inspection process. By 1998, 90 to 95% of the proscribed weapons capacity estimated to be in Iraq was accounted for and had been destroyed as a result of the UN inspection process. The sticking point in the inspections related to the extensive set of structures devoted to Saddam Hussein's personal security and the security of the Ba'ath Party. A procedure, known as modalities for sensitive site inspection, was therefore agreed upon through which 4 UN inspectors could enter immediately and search those facilities. Yet, in the case of the inspection of a Ba'ath Party headquarters in Baghdad in December 1998, the United States, rather than simply allowing the UN to send in its 4 inspectors, acted on its own, by insisting on sending in additional intelligence officers. The goal was to penetrate I-1 Hussein's security apparatus, unrelated to the inspection of weapons of mass destruction, and to provoke an international incident. The whole operation, according to Ritter, was directed by the U.S. National Security Council, which gave orders directly to Richard Butler, who was then the head of the UN inspection team. Iraq protested against this gross infringement of the modalities for sensitive site inspection, and the United States used this as the pretext, in Ritter's account, for a fabricated crisis, ordering the UN inspectors out and 2 days later initiating a 72-hour bombing campaign, known as Operation Desert Fox, directed at Saddam Hussein's personal security apparatus. Intelligence on Ba'ath Party hidcos obtained through U.S. violations of the UN weapons inspection process was used to guide the bombings. Alter that Iraq refused to readmit inspectors to sensitive sites, objecting that these inspections were being used to spy on the Iraqi government, and the UN inspection process fell apart. In this way, Washington electively torpedoed the final stage of the UN inspection process and made it clear that its real goal was regime change rather than disarmament. It had used the inspection process as a Trojan horse in its attempts to destroy the Iraqi regime. Military, political, and economic aspects are intertwined in all stages of imperialism, as well as capitalism in general. However, oil is the single most important strategic factor governing U.S. ambitions in the Middle East. In addition to the profit potential of all that oil for large corporations, the fact that the United States, with about 2% of known oil reserves in the world, uses 25% of the world's annual output gives it an added impetus to attempt to exert control over supplies. There can be no doubt that the United States seeks to control Iraqi oil production and the second largest set of proven oil reserves in the world, consisting of over 110 billion barrels, or 12% of world supply. The Middle East as a whole contains 65% of the world's proven oil reserves. Of 73 ELDs discovered in Iraq so far, only about a third are producing at present. The U.S. Energy Department estimates that Iraq also has as much as 220 billion barrels in probable and possible reserves, making the estimated total enough to cover U.S. annual oil imports at their current level for 98 years. It is calculated that Iraq could raise its oil production from 3 million to 6 million barrels a day within 7 years after the lifting of sanctions. More optimistic gurs see Iraqi oil production rising to as much as 10 million barrels a day. The U.S. Department of Energy projects that global oil demand could grow from the current 77 million barrels a day to as much as 120 million barrels a day in the next 20 years, with the sharpest increases in demand occurring in the United States and China. At present about 24% of U.S. oil imports come from the Middle East, and this is expected to rise rapidly as alternative sources dry up. OPEC under the leadership of Saudi Arabia, however, has kept oil supplies low in order to keep prices up. Middle East oil production has stagnated over the last 20 years, with overall OPEC production capacity lower today than in 1980. For this reason the security and availability of oil supplies has become a growing issue for U.S. corporations and U.S. strategic interests. right-wing pundit and Yale professor, Donald Kagan, has stated, "When we have economic problems, it's been caused by disruptions in our oil supply. If we have a foreseen Iraq, there will be no disruption in oil supplies." 7 Already U.S. oil corporations are positioning themselves for the day when they will be able to return to Iraq and Iran. According to Robert Allison _R chairman of the ANULRL2ITMLT, almost completely surrounded by U.S. military bases in Man to the south, and Pakistan and Afghanistan to the east. It would make it easier for the United States to protect planned oil pipelines extending from the Caspian Sea in Central Asia through Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. It would give Washington a much more solid military base in the Middle East, where it already has tens of thousands of troops located in 10 countries. Would increase U.S. leverage in relation to Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern states. It would strengthen the global superpowers' efforts to lower terms favorable to Israeli expansion, and the dispossession of Palestinians on the entire Middle East. It would make the rising economic power of China, along with Europe and _APAN, increasingly dependent on a U.S.-dominated oil regime in the Middle East for their most vital energy needs. Control of oil wrongly military force would thus translate into greater economic, political, and military power on a global scale. Early 1070s, as a result of the loss of economic ground to Europe and _APAN over the course of the previous quarter century, and due to the delinelting gold dollar from gold in L97L_, it was widely believed that the United States was losing its position as the hegemonic capitalist power. However, in the 1905 the collapse of the Soviet Union, which left the United States as the sole superpower, and faster growth in the United States than Europe and Japan, suddenly revealed a very different reality. The idea arose in U.S. strategic circles of an American empire beyond anything seen in the history all capitalist or of the world, a true Pax Americana. U.S. foreign policy analysts now refer to this as the rise of a unipolar world. The consolidation of such a unipolar world on a permanent basis has emerged as the explicit goal of the Bush administration a year after the September 11 attacks. In the words OLC, Olkenberry, the new grand strategy begins with a fundamental commitment to maintaining a unipolar world in which the United States has no peer competitor. No coalition oligarchat powers without the United States will be allowed to achieve hegemony. Bush made this point the centerpiece of American security policy in his West Point commencement address in _UN. America has, and intends to keep, military strengths beyond challenge, thereby making the destabilizing arms race fodder eras pointless, and limiting rivalries to trade and other pursuits of peace. The United States grew faster than the other major states during the decade, it reduced military spending more slowly, and it dominated investment in the technological advancement of its forces. Today, however, the new goal is to make these advantages permanent, a fait accompli that will prompt other states to not even try to catch up. Some thinkers have described the strategy as breakout, in which the United States moves so quickly to develop technological advantages that no state or coalition could ever challenge it as global leader, protector, and enforcer. Such a grab for unlimited imperial dominance is bound to fail in the long run. Imperialism under capitalism has centrifugal as well as centripetal tendencies. Military dominance cannot be maintained without maintaining economic dominance as well, and the latter is inherently unstable under capitalism. The immediate reality, however, is that the United States is moving very rapidly to increase its control at the expense of both potential rivals and the global South. The likely result is an intensification of exploitation on a world scale, along with a resurgentio of imperialist rivalries, since other capitalist countries will naturally seek to keep the United States from achieving its breakout strategy. The goal of an expanding American empire is seen by the administration not only as a strategy for establishing the United States permanently as the world's paramount power, but also as a way out of the nation's economic crisis that shows no signs at present of going away. The administration clearly believes it can stimulate the economy through military spending and increased arms exports. But enhanced military spending associated with a war may also contribute to economic problems, since it will undoubtedly cut further into spending for social programs that not only help people but also create the demand for consumer goods that business needs badly to stimulate economic growth. Historically, attempts to use imperial expansion as a way around needed economic and social changes at home have nearly always failed. In the end, what we must understand is that the new U.S. doctrine of world domination is a product not of a particular administration, but rather the culmination of developments in the most recent phase of imperialism. Reversing the drive to greater empire will not be easy. But the will of the people can play a critical role in how far Washington is able to proceed with its imperial ambitions. For this reason, mobilization of the population both in the United States and abroad in a militant struggle against both war and imperialism is of the utmost importance to the future of humanity. N. November 11, 2000, Richard L. Loss, a member of the National Security Council and Special Assistant to the President under the elder Bush, soon to be appointed Director of Policy Planning in the State Department of newly elected President George W. Bush, delivered a paper in Atlanta entitled Imperial America. For the United States to succeed at its objectivity of global preeminence, he declared, it would be necessary for Americans to reconceive their role from a traditional nation-state to an imperial power. Haas eschewed the term imperialist in describing America's role, preferring imperial, since the latter connoted exploitation, normally for commercial ends, and territorial control. Nevertheless, the intent was perfectly clear. To advocate an imperial foreign policy is to call for a foreign policy that attempts to organize the world along certain principles relating relations between states and conditions within them. The U.S. role would resemble L.9th century Great Britain. Coercion and the use oligarchy would normally be a last resort, what was written by John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson about Britain a century and a half ago, that the British policy followed the principle of extending control informally if possible and normally if necessary, could be applied to the American role at the start of the new century. The existence of an American empire is no secret. LT is widely, even universally recognized in most parts of the world, though traditionally denied by the powers that be in the United States. What Haas was calling for, however, was a much more open acknowledgement of this imperial role by Washington, in full view of the American population and the world, in order to further Washington's imperial ambitions. The fundamental question that continues to confront American foreign policy, he explained, is what to do with the surplus of power and the many and considerable advantages the surplus confers on the United States. This surplus of power could only be put to use by recognizing that the United States had imperial interests on the scale of low 3 retain in the 19th century. The world should therefore be given notice that Washington is prepared to extend its control, informally if possible and formally if not, to secure what it considers to be its legitimate interests across the face of the globe. The null section of Haas' paper carried the heading Imperialism Begins at Home. It concluded, the greater risk facing the United States at this juncture is that it will squander the opportunity to bring about a world supportive of its core interests by doing too little. Imperial understretch, not overstretch, appears the greater danger of the two. There is every reason to believe that the Imperial America argument espoused by Haas represents in broad outline the now dominant view of the U.S. ruling class, together with the U.S. state that primarily serves that class. After many years of denying the existence of U.S. empire, received opinion in the United States has now adopted a position that glories in the American imperium, with its imperial military, and imperial protectorates. This shift in external posture RST occurred at the end of 1990s, when it became apparent that not only was the United States the sole remaining superpower following the demise of the Soviet Union, but also that Europe and Japan, due to slowdowns in their rates of economic growth relative to that of the United States, were now less able to rival it economically. Nor did Europe seem to be able to act militarily without the United States even within its own region, in relation to the debacle of the Yugoslavian civil wars. After Washington launched its global war on terrorism, following September 11, 2001, the imperial dimensions of U.S. foreign policy were increasingly obvious. U.S. empire is therefore now portrayed by political pundits and the mainstream media as a necessary burden falling on the United States as a result of its unparalleled role on the world stage. The United States is said to be at the head of a new kind of empire, divorced from national interest, economic exploitation, Reichstum, or colonialism, existing only to promote freedom and human rights. As Michael Natil proclaimed in the MW1/R7FIIL. British policy followed the principle of extending control informally if possible and formally if necessary. To label the one method anti-imperialist and the other imperialist, is to ignore the fact that whatever the method, British interests were steadily safeguarded and extended. The usual summing up of the policy of free trade. Empire as trade not rule should read trade with informal control if possible, trade with rule when necessary. Despite attempts at imperialism on the cheap, the foreign challenge to British paramountcy in tropical Africa and the comparative absence there of large-scale, strong, indigenous political organizations which had sowed informal expansion so well elsewhere, eventually dictated the switch to formal rule. For those seeking to comprehend British imperialism in the 19th century, this argument suggested, it is the imperialism of free trade and not Colorado nihilism that should be the primary focus. Only when the economic ends of Britain could not be secured by informal control did it resort to formal imperialism or colonization, that is, direct and continuing use of military and political control to achieve its ends. Mommsen noted in his Theories of LMF, Ariely.rm, the significance of this concept of informal imperialism was had it tended to bridge the gap between non-Marxist and Marxist approaches, since it stressed the historical continuity of imperialism as a manifestation of economic expansion. LLY recognizing that there are antimerous informal types of imperialistic domination which precede or accompany the establishment of formal rule, or even make it unnecessary. Western thinking on the subject of imperialism has drawn closer to Marxist theory. Generally speaking, most non-Marxist theoreticians admit nowadays that dependency of an imperialist sort may well result from the most varied kinds of informal influence, especially of an economic nature. Imperialist forces at the colonial periphery were by no means alleged constantly to resort to the actual use of political power. It was generally quite enough to know that the imperialist groups could count on support from the metropolitan power in the event of a crisis. Formal political rule thus appears only as the most specific, but not the normal type of imperialist dependence. Ironically, Gallagher and Robinson distinguished their approach from the classic accounts on Hobson and Lenin by associating both Hobson's and Lenin's views with a narrower spectrum of cases involving formal control or Colorado nihilism. By identifying the last quarter of the 19th century, when colonial annexations were at their height, as a qualitatively new stage of capitalism, the monopoly or imperialist stage. Lenin in particular, these authors argued, had come to associate imperialism with formal rather than informal control. However, this criticism fell wide off mark, since Lenin himself had emphasized that imperialism did not necessarily involve formal control, as witnessed especially by British imperialism in Latin America in the 19th century. The division of the world into colony-owning countries on the one hand and colonies on the other, he observed, did not exhaust the core periphery relations between nation-states. Indeed, Lenin pointed to a variety of forms of dependent countries, which, officially, are politically independent, but which are, in fact, enmeshed in the net of financial and diplomatic dependence, the semi-colony, including cases like Argentina, which was so dependent financially on London that it was a virtual colony. The reality of an informal imperialism of free trade was never an enigma to Marxist theory, which viewed imperialism as a historical process associated with capitalist expansion only secondarily elected by the particular political forms in which it manifested itself. The reason for characterizing the last quarter of the 19th century as the imperialist stage in the work of Lenin and most subsequent Marxist theorists, did not have to do mainly with a shift from informal to formal imperialism, or the mere fact of wide-spread annexations within the periphery, but rather with the evolution of capitalism itself, which had developed into its monopoly stage, creating a qualitatively new type of imperialism. It was this historically specific analysis of imperialism as a manifestation of capitalist development in all of its complexity that was to give the Marxist theory of imperialism its importance as a coherent way of understanding the deeper globalizing tendencies of the system. In this interpretation, there was a sense in which imperialism was inherent in capitalism from the beginning. Many of the features of contemporary imperialism, such as the development of the world market, the division between core and periphery, the competitive hunt for colonies or semi-colonies, the extraction of surplus, the securing of raw materials to bring back to the mother country, etc., are part of capitalism as a global system from the late 15th century on. Imperialism, in the widest sense, had its sources in the accumulation dynamic of the system, which encouraged the countries at the center of the capitalist world economy, and particularly the wealthy interests within these countries, to feather their own nests by appropriating surplus and vital resources from the periphery, what Pirandelli called the pillage of the Third World. By a variety of coercive means, the poorer satellite economies were so structured beginning in the age of conquest in the late 15th and 16th centuries that their systems of production and distribution served not so much their own needs as those of the dominant metropoles. Nevertheless, the recognition of such commonalities in imperialism in the various phases of capitalist development was entirely consistent with the observation that there had been a qualitative change in the nature and significance of imperialism that commenced in the last quarter of the 19th century, sufficient to cause Lenin to associate this with a new stage of capitalism. Mandists have therefore often distinguished between an older imperialism and what was called the new imperialism that began in the final decades of the 19th century. What distinguished this new imperialism were primarily two things: the breakdown of British hegemony and increased competition for control over global territories between the various advanced capitalist states, and the rise of monopolistic corporations, large, integrated industrial and financial firms as the dominant economic actors in all of the advanced capitalist states. The new mammoth corporations by their very nature sought to expand beyond national bounds and dominate global production and consumption. The drive to monopoly control within larger anal corporations. All of this became the context in which older phenomena, such as the extraction of surplus, the race for control of raw materials and resources, the creation of economic dependencies in the global periphery, and the unending contest among rival capitalist powers, manifested themselves in new and transformed ways. It was this understanding of imperialism as a historical reality of capitalist development, one that took on new characteristics as the system itself evolved, that most sharply separated the Marxist approach from mainstream interpretations. The latter frequently saw imperialism as a mere policy and associated it primarily with political and military actions on the part of states. In the widely disseminated mainstream view, imperialism was present only in overt instances of political and territorial control ushered in by actual military conquest. In the contrasting Marxist view, imperialism occurred not simply through the policies of states but also through the actions of corporations and the mechanisms of trade, finance, and investment. It involved a whole constellation of class relations, including the nurturing of local collaborators or comprador elements in the dependent societies. Any explanation of how modern imperialism worked thus necessitated a description of the entire system of monopoly capitalism. Informal control only entries on the periphery of the capitalist world system by countries at the center of the system was as important, in this view, as formal control. Struggles over hegemony and more generally rivalries among the leading capitalist states were continuous, but took on changing forms depending on the economic, political, and military resources at their disposal. The main distinguishing feature of modern imperialism, in the Marxist view, was associated with the rise to dominance of the giant corporations, the ordering of power within the system, as reflected in the relative position of various nation-states, nonetheless shifted considerably over time. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the principal global reality was the decline in British hegemony in Europe and the increased rivalry among the advanced capitalist states that followed, leading to the First and Second World Wars. The rise of the Soviet Union in the context of the First World War posed an external challenge to the system eventually, leading to a Cold War struggle between the United States, the new hegemonic power of the capitalist world economy following the Second World War, and pointed out that regime change often can only be accomplished through a full-scale military invasion, leaving the conquered nation in ruins and necessitating subsequent nation building. It is difficult to target specific individuals with military force. U.S. efforts to use force to bring about changes in political leadership failed in the cases of Gaddafi in Libya, Saddam in Iraq, and aid in Somalia. Force can create a context in which political change is more likely, but without extraordinary intelligence and more than a little good fortune, force by itself is unlikely to bring about speculative political changes. The only way to increase the likelihood of such change is through highly intrusive lawful intervention, such as nation building, which involves first eliminating opposition and then engaging in an occupation that allows for substantial engineering of another society. Such a nation-building occupation, loss stressed, involves defeating endless and Ngani local opposition and establishing a political authority that enjoys a monopoly or near monopoly of control over the legitimate use of force. It therefore requires, as Haas observed quoting one foreign policy analyst, an occupation of imperial proportions and possibly of endless duration. Is precisely this kind of invasion of imperial proportions and uncertain duration that now seems to be the main agenda of Washington's war on terrorism. In the occupation and nation-building processes following COS, explicit colonialism, in the most brazen 19th century sense, will be avoided. No formal annexation will take place, and at least a pretense of local rule will be established from the beginning, even during direct military occupation. Nevertheless, a central goal will be to achieve some of what colonialism in its classic form previously accomplished. As Magdal pointed out, colonialism considered as the direct application of military and political force was essential to reshape the social and economic institutions of many old dependent countries to the needs of the metropolitan centers. Once this reshaping had been accomplished, economic losses, thc international price, marketing, and financial business were by themselves sufficient to perpetuate and indeed intensify the relationship of dominance and exploitation between mother country and colony. These circumstances, the colony could be granted laurel political independence without changing anything essential, and without interfering too seriously with the interests which had originally led to the conspicuous Old Sea colony. Something of this sort is occurring in Afghanistan and is now being envisioned for Iraq. Once account has been alatel disarranged and reshot, et to L7. Fit the needs of the countries at the center of the capitalist world, nation building will be complete and the occupation will presumably come to an end. But in areas that contain vital resources like oil, a shift back from formal to informal imperialism after an invasion may be slow to take place or will occur only in very limited ways. Informal control, or the mechanism of global accumulation that systematically favors the core nations, constitutes the normal means through which imperialist exploitation of the periphery operates. But this requires, on occasion, extraordinary means in order to bring recalcitrant states back into conformity with the market and with the international hierarchy of power. At present, U.S. imperialism appears particularly blatant because it is linked directly with war in this way and points to an endless series of wars in the future to achieve essentially the same ends. However, if we wish to understand the underlying forces at work, we should not let this heightened militarism and aggression distract us from the inner logic of imperialism, most evident in the rising gap in income and wealth between rich and poor countries, and in the net transfers of economic surplus from periphery to center that make this possible. The growing polarization of wealth and poverty between nations is the system's crowning achievement on the world stage. It is also what is ultimately at issue in the struggle against modern imperialism. As Magdoff argues in Imperialism with/tout colonies, there is an essential oneness to economic, political, and military domination under capitalism. Those seeking to oppose the manifestations of imperialism must recognize that it is impossible to challenge any one of them effectively without calling into question all the others and hence the entire system. The new age of imperialism. Imperialism is meant to serve the needs of a ruling class much more than a nation. It has nothing to do with democracy. Perhaps for that reason it has often been characterized as a parasitic phenomenon even by critics, as a studies_on Hobson in his 1902 classic, I7N is found around the notion that America should use its power vigorously to reshape the world. But what is missing from The Economist and from all such mainstream discussions is the recognition that imperialism in this case, as always, is not simply a policy but a systematic ICRMHTY arising from the very nature of capitalist development. The historical changes in imperialism, associated with the rise of what has been called a unipolar world, defy any attempt to reduce current developments to the misguided ambitions of a few powerful individuals. It is therefore necessary to address the historical underpinnings of the new age of U.S. imperialism, including both its deeper causes and the particular actors that are helping to shape its present path. The question of whether the United States in engaging in imperialist expansion has allowed itself to become prey to the particular whims of those at society's political helm is not a new one. Harry Magdoff addressed this thesis on the very first page of his 1969 book, The Age of Imperialism, The Economics of U.S. Foreign Policy, a work that can be said to have reintroduced the systematic study of imperialism in the United States. Is the war part of a more general and consistent scheme of United States external policies, he asked, or is it an aberration of a particular group of men in power? The answer of course was that although there were particular individuals in power who were spearheading this process, it reflected deep-seated tendencies within U.S. foreign policy that had roots in capitalism itself. In what was to emerge as the most important account of U.S. imperialism in the 19,603, Magdoff set about uncovering the underlying economic, political, and military forces governing U.S. foreign policy. The ruling explanation at the time of the Vietnam War was that the United States was engaged in the war in order to contain communism, and hence the war itself had nothing to do with imperialism. But the scale and ferocity of the war seemed to belie any attempt to explain it in terms of mere containment, since neither the Soviet Union nor China had shown any global expansionary tendencies, and Third World Revolutions rejected both the dominant tendency in the United States to see U.S. interventions in the Third World as a protocol the Cold War and the liberal penchant to see the war as an aberration of a Texan president and the advisors surrounding him. Instead, historical analysis was required. The imperialism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the breakdown in British hegemony, and the growth of monopoly capitalism, or a capitalistii dominated by large firms, resulting from the concentration and centralization of productioti. Beyond these features that distinguished what Lenin referred to as the stage of imperialism, there are a number of other elements that have to be considered. Capitalism is of course a system uniquely determined by a drive to accumulate, which accepts no bounds to its expansion. Capitalism is on the one hand an expanding world economy characterized by a process that we now call globalization, while on the other hand it is divided politically into numerous competing nation-states. Further, the system is polarized at every level into center and periphery. From its beginning in the 16th and 17th centuries, and even more 50 in the monopoly stage, capital within each nation-state at the center of the system is driven by a need to control access to raw materials and labor in the periphery. In the monopoly stage of capitalism, moreover, nation-states and their corporations strive to keep as much off-world economy as possible open to their own investments, though not necessarily to those of their competitors. This competition over spheres of accumulation creates a scramble for control of various parts of the periphery, the most famous example of which was the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, in which all old Western European powers of the day took part. Imperialism, however, continued to evolve beyond this classic phase, which ended with the Second World War and subsequent decolonization in Ovidnant and in the 19,505 and 19,605. A later phase presented its own historically specific characteristics. Most important oldest was the United States replacing Britain as legitimate of the capitalist world economy. The other was the existence of the Soviet Union, creating space for revolutionary movements in the Third World, and helping to bring the leading capitalist powers into a Cold War military alliance reinforcing U.S. hegemony. The United States utilized its hegemonic position to establish the Bretton Woods institutions, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, with intention of consolidating the economic control exercised by the center states, and the United States in particular, over the periphery and hence the entire world in realitet. In Magdaleff's conception, the existence of U.S. hegemony did not bring to an end the competition between capitalist states. Electnoni was always understood by realistic analysts as historically transitory, despite the constant references to the American century. The uneven development of capitalism meant continual inter-imperialist rivalry, even if somewhat hidden at times. Antagonism between unevenly developing industrial centers, he wrote, is the hub of the imperialist. U.S. militarism, which in this analysis went hand in hand with its imperial role, was not simply or even mainly a product of the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, by which it was conditioned. Militarism had deeper roots in the need of the United States, as the hegemonic power of the capitalist world economy, to keep the doors open for foreign investment by resorting to force, if necessary. At the same time, the United States was employing its power where possible to advance the needs of its own corporations, as for example in Latin America, where its dominance was unquestioned by other great powers. Not only did the United States exercise this military role on numerous occasions throughout the periphery in the post-Second World War period, but during that period it was also able to justify this as part of the fight against communism. Militarism, associated with this role as global hegemon and alliance leader, came to permeate all aspects of accumulation in the United States, so that the term military-industrial complex, introduced by Eisenhower in his departing speech as president, was an understatement. Already in his day there was no major center of accumulation in the United States that was not also a major center of military production. Military production helped prop up the entire economic ethos in the United States, and was a factor holding off economic stagnation. In mapping contemporary imperialism, Magdaleff's analysis provided evidence demonstrating how directly beneficial imperialism was to capital within the core of the system. The siphoning of surplus from the periphery was a major factor in perpetuating underdevelopment. Unique and less noticed, however, were two other aspects of Magdo, and A1N. policy, in which he argued that the saving grace for the United States in Vietnam was the essentially disinterested character with which it approached the war. Tucker's perspective was that of a liberal opponent of the war who nonetheless rejected radical interpretations of U.S. militarism and imperialism. Tucker's main targets in his book were William Appleman Williams, Gabriel Kalko, and Harry Magdoff. Magdoff was attacked specifically for arguing that control of raw materials on a global basis was crucial to U.S. corporations and the U.S. state that served them. Tucker went so far as to claim that the error of Magdoff's view was shown where the issue of oil arose. If the United States were truly imperialist in its orientation to Third World resources, he argued, it would attempt to control Persian Gulf oil. Defying both logic and history, Tucker declared that this was not the case. As he put it, given the radical view, one would expect that here, if anywhere, American policy would faithfully reflect economic interests. The reality, as is well known, is otherwise. Apart from the increasing and successful pressures oil countries have employed to increase their royalty and tax income, the American government has contributed to the steady deterioration old law/oral, LC position American oil companies once enjoyed in the Middle East. A.RVCWLFRRKIIMR. Correspondent John M. Lee, writes. The renewal talilating to many OL servers is that the oil companies and oil considerations have had such little influence in American IORSN policy toward Israel. The case of Persian Gulf oil, then, according to Tucker, disproved Magdoli's insistence on the importance of controlling raw materials to the operation of U.S. imperialism. The U.S. political commitment to Israel was counter to its economic interests, but had overridden all concerns of U.S. capitalism with respect to Middle East oil. Today it is hardly necessary to emphasize how absurd this contention was. Not only has the United States repeatedly intervened militarily in the Middle East, beginning with Iran in 1953, but it has also continually sought to promote its control over oil and the interests of its oil corporations in the region. Israel, which the U.S. has aimed to the teeth and which has been allowed to develop hundreds of nuclear weapons, has long been part of this strategy of controlling the region. From the RST, the U.S. role in the Middle East has been openly imperialistic, geared to maintaining control over the region's oil resources. Only an analysis that reduced economics to commodity prices and royalty income while ignoring the political and military shaping of economic relations, not to mention the flows off both oil and prots, could result in such obvious errors. //WNewHQ//2/6/I Since the Vietnam War. Indeed, prior to 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet bloc, a major U.S. war in the region would have been almost completely unthinkable. This left U.S. dominance in the region significantly constrained. The 1991 Gulf War, which was carried out by the United States with Soviet acquiescence, thus marked the beginning of a new age of U.S. imperialism and expansion of U.S. global power. It is no mere accident that the weakening of the Soviet Union led almost immediately to a full-scale U.S. military intervention in the region that was /I//T/id I2-LL/I.L// Decaido controlling world oil, the most critical global resource, and thus critical Tony strategy of global domination. It is essential to understand that in 1991, when the Gulf War occurred, the Soviet Union was greatly weakened and subservient to U.S. policy. Bulletin. It was no year dead, and there was still the possibility, outliotygladim, oliaku, or upset and a turnaround in Soviet affairs unfavorable to U.S. interests. At the Satni time, the United States was still in a position where it had lost economic ground to some of its main competitors, and hence there was a widespread sense that its economic hegemony had seriously declined, limiting its course of action. Although the administration of George H.W. Bush declared a new world order, no one knew what this meant. The collapse of the Soviet bloc had been so sudden that the U.S. ruling class and the foreign policy elites were unsure of how to proceed. During the first Gulf War, the U.S. elites were split. Some believed that the U.S. should go on and invade Iraq, as the Wall Street Journal advised at the time. Others thought that an invasion and occupation of Iraq was not then feasible. Over the course of the next decade, the dominant topic of discussion in U.S. foreign policy, as witnessed, for example, by the Council on Foreign Relations publication, FO1EIG NAIS, was how to exploit the fact that the United States was now the sole superpower. Discussions of unipolarity and unilateralism were soon coupled with open discussions on U.S. primacy, hegemony, empire, and even imperialism. Moreover, as the decade wore on, the arguments in favor of the United States exercising an imperial role became more and more pervasive and concrete. Such issues were discussed from the beginning of the new era not in terms of ends but in terms of efficacy. A particularly noteworthy example of the call for a new imperialism could be found in an influential book, entitled The Inifyamel Kempfitterlion, again by Robert W. Tucker, along with David C. Hendrickson. As Tucker and Hendrickson forthrightly explained, the United States is today the dominant military power in the world. In the reach and electiveness of its military forces, America compares favorably with some old greatest empires known to history. Rome reached barely beyond the compass off Mediterranean, whereas Napoleon could not break out into the Atlantic and went to defeat in the vast Russian spaces. During the high till the so-called Lex Britannica, when the Royal Navy ruled the seas, Lismerel reiterated that if the 5 IMN-/KLI, L/L Euro LL-/L/. British Annie landed on the Prussian coast, he would have it arrested by the local police. The United States has an altogether more formidable collection of forces than its predecessors among the world's great powers. LT has global reach. LT possesses the most technologically advanced arms, commanded by professionals skilled in the art of war. It can transport powerful continental armies over oceanic distances. LT's historic adversaries are in retreat, broken by internal discord. Under these circumstances, an age-old temptation, the imperial temptation, may prove compelling for the United States. The nation is not likely to be attracted to the visions of empire that animated colonial powers of the past. It may well be attractive, however, a vision that enables the nation to assume an imperial role without fooling classic duties ol imperial rule. The imperial temptation, these authors made clear, was to be resisted less because of the fact that this would have constituted a renewal of classic imperialism, but because the United States was only willing to go halfway, unleashing its military force but neglecting to take on the more burdensome responsibilities of imperial rule associated with nation building. Proceeding from a nation-building perspective reminiscent of Kennedy-style Cold War liberalism, but also attractive to some neoconservatives, Tucker and Hendrickson presented the case that the United States, having fought the Gulf War, should have immediately proceeded to invade, occupy, and pacify Iraq, removing the Ba'ath Party from power, thus exercising its imperial responsibility. The overwhelming display of military power, they wrote, would have provided the United States with time to foment and recognize a provisional Iraqi government consisting of individuals committed to a broadly liberal platform. Though such a government would undoubtedly have been accused of being an American puppet, there are good reasons for thinking that it might have acquired considerable legitimacy. LT would have enjoyed access, under UN supervision, to Iraq's oil revenues, which surely would have won it considerable support from the Iraqi people. Tucker and Hendrickson, in spite of Tucker's argument decades earlier against Magdal, that the failure to seize control of Persian Gulf oil was evidence that the U.S. was not an imperialist power, were under no illusions about when occupation of Iraq would be in U.S. strategic interest. In one word, oil. There is no other commodity, they wrote, that has the crucial significance of oil. There is no parallel to the dependence of developed and developing economies on the energy resources of the Gulf. These resources are concentrated in an area that remains relatively inaccessible and highly unstable, and possession of oil affords an unparalleled natural base whereby an expansionist developing power may hope to realize its aggressive ambitions. The need for the United States to achieve domination over the Middle East was therefore not in doubt. If it resorts to force under these exceptional conditions, it should do so responsibly while extending its rule as well. This argument comes out of the liberal rather than conservative side of the U.S. foreign policy establishment and ruling class discussions. The debate within the establishment is narrow, with many liberal foreign policy analysts because of their penchant for nation building, much closer to neoconservatives, and declared, our strategy must now refocus on precluding the emergence of any potential future global competitor. Questioning this strategy in his book The Reluctant S/Third, IIOS claimed that it was ill-conceived for the simple reason that the United States did not have the capacity to prevent new global powers emerging. Such powers emerge along with the growth of their material resources. Great economic powers will inevitably have the capacity to become great powers generally, and the extent to which they emerge as full military powers will depend mostly on their own perception of national interests, threats, political culture, and economic strength. The only rational long-term strategy, since the perpetuation of hegemony or primacy was impossible, was what Madeleine Albright termed assertive multilateralism, or what I lost the sheriff and posse approach, with the sheriffald as the United States and the posse as a coalition of the willing. The sheriff and the posse need not worry much about the law, he noted, but must nonetheless be wary of crossing over into vigilantism. By November 2000, just before he was hired to be head of policy planning in Colin Powell's State Department in the administration of President George W. Bush, Haas delivered a paper in Atlanta called Imperial America, in which he argued that the United States should fashion an imperial foreign policy that makes use of its surplus of power to extend its control across the face of the globe. While still denying that lasting hegemony was possible, Haas declared that the United States should use the exceptional opportunity that it now enjoyed to reshape its world in order to enhance its global strategic assets. This meant military interventions around the world. Imperial understretch, not overstretch, he argued, appears to be the greater danger of the two. By 2002, Haas, speaking for an administration preparing to invade Iraq, was pronouncing that a failed state, unable to control terrorism within its own territory, had lost the nominal advantages of sovereignty, including the right to be left alone inside own territory. Other governments, including the US, the right to intervene. In the case of terrorism, this can even lead to a right of preventive, or preemptory, self-defense. In September 2000, 2 months before Haas presented his Imperial America paper, the neoconservative Project for the New American Century had issued a report entitled Rebuilding America, DULMS, drawn up at the request of Dick Cheney, and including among its signatories Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, George W. Bush's younger Rother_EB, and Louis Libby. The report declared that at present the United States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible. The main strategic goal of the United States in the 21st century was to preserve PMANMMNA. To achieve this, it was necessary to expand the American security perimeter by establishing new overseas LASs and forward operations throughout the world. On the question of the Persian Gulf, LTCBU.ILDI1IG America, QFCN.SRS was no less explicit. The United States for decades sought to play a more preeminent role in Gulf regional security. While the unresolved conflict with Iraq provides the India_Istilakalian, the need for a substantial American force presence in the Gulf transcends the issue of regime of Saddam Hussein 7 even before September 11. Therefore, the ruling class and its foreign policy elites had moved towards an explicit policy of expanding the American empire. Taking full advantage of was regarded as the limited window brought on by the demise of the Soviet Union and before new rivals off-scale could arise. The 1990s saw the U.S. economy, despite the slowdown in the secular growth trend, advance more rapidly than that of Europe and Japan. This was particularly the case in the bubble years of the latter half of the 1905. The Yugoslavian civil wars meanwhile demonstrated that Europe was unable to act militarily without the United States. Hence, by the end of 1905, discussions of U.S. empire and imperialism cropped up not so much on the left as in liberal and neoconservative circles, where imperial ambitions were openly proclaimed. Following September 200, the disposition to carry out massive military interventions to promote the expansion of U.S. power, in which the United States would once again put its boots on the ground, as neoconservative pundit Max Boot expressed it in his book The Savage Wars Zero FLEs, became part of the dominant ruling class consensus. The administration's national security strategy statement, transmitted to Congress in September 2002, promoted the principle of preemptive attacks against potential enemies and declared, the United States must and will maintain the capability to defeat any attempt by an enemy to impose its will on the United States, our allies, or our friends. Our forces will be strong enough to dissuade potential adversaries from pursuing a military build-up in the hope all surpassing, or equaling, the power of the United States. In at war with ourselves, W/Lee America is Krieg at C/LE a unipolarity well disguised as multipolarity. This is not a debate about whether the United States should extend its empire, but rather whether the imperial temptation will be accompanied by the assertion of imperial responsibility, in the manner raised by Tucker and Hendrickson. Commenting on nation-building interventions, Hirsch declares there is no czar for failed states as there is for homeland security or the war on drugs. Perhaps there should be. Two what have been called nation-building interventions, originally rejected by the Bush administration, are no longer in question. This can be seen in the Council on Foreign Relations report, Iraq, the day A_/Ler, published shortly before the U.S. invasion, and addressing nation-building in Iraq. One of task force members in the development of that report was James F. Dobbins, director of the Rand Corporation Center for International Security and Defense Policy, who served as the Clinton administration's special envoy during the interventions in Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, and Kosovo, and also as special envoy for the Bush War. He asked, part of a more general and consistent scheme of United States external policies, or is it an aberration of a particular group of men in power? There is now a general agreement within the establishment itself that objective forces and security requirements are driving U.S. expansionism, that it is in the general interest of High Command of U.S. capitalism to extend its control over the world as far and for as long as possible. According to the Project for the New American Century report, Rebuilding ANMICA Estfmses, it is necessary to seize the unipolar moment. The wider left's tendency over the last 2 years to focus on this new imperialist expansion as a neoconservative project involving a small sector of ruling class not reaching beyond the right wing of the Republican Party resting on particular expansive interests in the military and oil sectors is a disillusion. At present there is no serious split within the U.S. oligarchy or the Lauritan policy establishment, though these will undoubtedly develop in the Lutert as a result years down the road. There is no cabal, but a consensus rooted in ruling class needs and the dynamics imperialist done. There are, however, divisions between the United States and other leading states. Intercapitalist rivalry remains the oldie ituntreali lo coddled it be otherwise when the United States is trying to establish itself as the surrogate world government in a global imperial order. Although the Louisville Slates is attempting to reassert its hegemonic position in the world, it remains far weaker economically relative to other leading capitalist states, than it was at the beginning old post-Second World War period. In the late MS when the United States produced 50% of the world's gross national product, _Mx Dobbins stated in Iraq, the day after. It was able to perlomi those tassels more or less on its own. In the L990s, in the aftermath of the Cold War, America was able to lead much broader coalitions and thereby share the Berlin all-nation building much more widely. The United States cannot allboard and does not need to go it alone in building a free Iraq. It will secure broader participation, however only it pays attention to the lessons of C19903 as well as those of SML/S. In other words, for a stagnating U.S. economy that despite its relative economic gains in the late 1990s is in a much weaker economic position vis-a-vis its main competitors than in the years following the Second World War, outright legionistun is beyond its means, it remains dependent on coalitions all the willing. At the same time, it is clear that in the present period global hegemonic imperialism the United States is geared above all to expanding its imperial power to whatever extent possible and subordinating the rest of the capitalist world to its interests. The Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea basin represent not only the bulk of world petroleum reserves, but also a rapidly increasing proportion of total reserves as high production rates diminish reserves elsewhere. This has provided much of the stimulus for the United States to gain greater control of these resources at the expense of its present and potential rivals. But U.S. imperial ambitions do not end there, since they are driven by economic ambitions that know no bounds. As Magdalf knocked in the closing pages of T/it/lg, Q/IMFML/1it. In 1969, it is the professed goal zero food.s. Multinational corporations to control as large a share of the world market as they do of the United States market, and this hunger for foreign markets persists today. Florida-based Wackenhut Corrections Corporation has won prison privatization contracts in Australia, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, and the Netherlands Antilles. Promotion of U.S. corporate interests abroad is one of the primary responsibilities of the U.S. state. Consider the cases of Monsanto and genetically modified food, Microsoft and intellectual property, Bechtel and the war on Iraq. It would be impossible to exaggerate how dangerous this dual expansionism of U.S. corporations and the U.S. state is to the world at large. As Ernst van Mazaros observed, the U.S. attempt to seize global control, which is inherent in the workings of capitalism and imperialism, is now threatening humanity with the extreme violent rule of the whole world by one hegemonous imperialist country on a permanent basis, an absurd and unsustainable way of running the world order. 2. This new age of U.S. imperialism will generate its own contradictions, amongst them attempts by other major powers to assert their influence, resorting to similar belligerent means, and all sorts of strategies by weaker states and non-state actors to engage in asymmetric foamies of warfare. Given the unprecedented destructiveness of contemporary weapons, which are diffused ever more widely, the consequences for the population of the world could well be devastating beyond anything ever before witnessed. Rather than generating a new Pax Americana, the United States may be paving the way to new global holocausts. The greatest hope in these dire circumstances lies in a rising tide of revolt from below, both in the United States and globally. The growth of the anti-globalization movement, which dominated the world stage for nearly 2 years following the events in Seattle in November 1999, was succeeded in February 2003 by the largest global wave of anti-war protests in human history. Never before has the world's population risen up so quickly and in such massive numbers in the attempt to stop an imperialist war. The new age of imperialism is also a new age of revolt. The Vietnam Syndrome, which has so worried the strategic planners of the imperial order for decades, now seems not only to have left a deep legacy within the United States but also to have been coupled this time around with an empire syndrome on a much more global scale, something that no one really expected. This more than anything else makes it clear that the strategy of the American ruling class to expand the American empire cannot possibly succeed in the long run, and will prove to be its own, we hope not the world's, undoing. We are living in a period in which the rhetoric of empire knows few bounds. In a special report on America and Empire in August, the London-based Economist magazine asked whether the United States would, in the event of Reg-IME changes effected peacefully in Iran and Syria, really prepared to shoulder the white man's burden across the Middle East. The answer it gave was that this was unlikely. The U.S. commitment to empire did not go so far. What is significant, however, is that the question was asked at all. Current U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have led observers to wonder whether there aren't similarities and historical linkages between the new imperialism of the 21st century and the imperialism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Nathan Marcus, the BBC's defense correspondent, commented a few months back. It should be remembered that more than 100 years ago, the British poet Rudyard Kipling wrote his famous poem about what he styled as the white man's Erden, a warning about the responsibilities of empire that was directed not at London but at Washington and its newfound imperial responsibilities in the Philippines. It is not clear if President George W. Bush is a reader of poetry or of Kipling. But Kipling's sentiments are as relevant today as they were when the poem was written in the aftermath of the Spanish-American /M1R. A number of modern-day proponents of imperialism have also drawn con.ions with key INR's menu. which he ends with the lines, L1, FL. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Before discussing the reasons for this sudden renewed interest in laissez-tomber, in which Spain agreed to cede the Philippines to the new imperial power, along with its other possessions seized by the United States in the war. This was followed by a fierce debate in the Senate on the ratification of the treaty centering on the status of the Philippines, which, except for the city of Manila, was under the control of the nascent Philippine Republic. On February 4, 1899, U.S. troops under orders to provoke a conflict with the Filipino forces ringing Manila were moved into disputed ground lying between U.S. and Filipino lines on the outskirts of the city. When they encountered Filipino soldiers, the U.S. soldiers called El Lald and then opened fire, killing 3. The U.S. forces immediately began a general offensive with their full repower in what amounted to a surprise attack, inflicting enormous casualties on the Filipino troops. The San Francisco Call reported on February 5 that the moment the news reached Washington, McKinley told an intimate friend that the Manila engagement would, in his opinion, ensure the ratification of treaty tomorrow. These calculations proved correct, and on the following day the Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the Spanish-American War, ceding Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States, and putting Cuba under U.S. control. It stipulated that the United States would pay Spain $20 million for the territories that it gained through the war. But this did little to disguise the fact that the Spanish-American War was an outright seizure of an overseas colonial empire by the United States, in response to the perceived need of U.S. business just recovering from an economic downturn for new global markets. The United States immediately pushed forward in the offensive that it had begun 2 days before in what was to prove to be one of history's more barbaric wars of imperial conquest. The U.S. goal in this period was to expand not only into the Caribbean but also far into the Pacific, and by colonizing the Philippines lands to gain a doorway into the huge Chinese market. Kipling's White Man's Burden, subtitled The United States and the Philippine Islands, was published in McClure, Manzanrin L. Aruatyl 899 LT was written when the debate over ratification of the Treaty of Paris was still taking place, and while the anti-imperialist movement in the United States was loudly decrying the plan to annex the Philippines. Kipling urged the United States, with special reference to the Philippines, to underscore join Britain in the pursuit of racial responsibilities of empire. Your new Kotsolan peoples. Half devil and half child. Many in the United States, including President McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, welcomed Kipling's rousing call for the United States to engage in savage wars, beginning in the Philippines. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana declared, "God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration. He has made us adept in government that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples." In the end, more than 126,000 officers and men were sent to the Philippines to put down the Filipino resistance during a war that lasted officially from 1899 to 1902 but actually continued much longer, with sporadic resistance for most of a decade. U.S. troops logged 2,800 engagements with the Filipino resistance. At least 250,000 Filipinos, most of them civilians, were killed along with 4,200 U.S. soldiers. From the beginning it was clear that the Filipino forces were unable to match the United States in conventional warfare. They therefore quickly switched to guerrilla warfare. U.S. troops at war with the Filipinos boasted in a popular marching song that they would civilize them with the crag. Yet they found themselves facing interminable small attacks and ambushes by Filipinos, who often carried long knives known as bolos. These guerrilla attacks resulted in combat deaths of U.S. soldiers in small numbers on a regular basis. As in all prolonged guerrilla wars, the strength of the Filipino resistance was due to the lack that it had the support of the Filipino population in general. As General Arthur MacArthur, who became military governor of the Philippines in 1900, conded to a reporter in 1899. When IRST started in a these rel, CLSLL, believed that a Uinaldo's true, 5 re, 3 8. Resented Onlva faction. L0 Eulalian of LL. Luzon the native population that is was opposed to us and our offers o fate and good government. But after having come this far, after having occupied several towns and cities in succession, I have been reluctantly compelled to believe that the Filipino masses are loyal to Aguinaldo and the government which he heads. Faced with a guerrilla struggle supported by the vast majority of the population, the U.S. military responded by resettling populations in concentration camps, burning clown villages, mass hangings and bayoneting soft suspects, systematic raping of women and girls, and torture. The most infamous torture technique, used repeatedly in the war, was the so-called water cure. Vast quantities of water were forced down the throats of prisoners. Their stomachs were then stepped on so that the water shot out 3 feet in the air like an artesian well. Most victims died not long afterwards. General Frederick Funston did not hesitate to announce that he had personally strung up a group of 35 Filipino civilians suspected of supporting the Filipino revolutionaries. Major Edwin Glenn saw no reason to deny the charge that he had made a group of 47 Filipino prisoners kneel and repent of their sins before bayoneting and clubbing them to death. General Jacob Smith ordered his troops to kill and burn, to target everything over 10, and to turn the island of Samar into a howling wilderness. General William Shafter in California declared that it might be necessary to kill half the Filipino population in order to bring perfect justice to the other half. During the Philippine War, the United States reversed the normal casualty statistics of war. Usually many more are wounded than killed. According to official statistics, U.S. troops killed 15 times as many Filipinos as they wounded. This led with frequent reports by U.S. soldiers that wounded and captured Filipino combatants were summarily executed on the spot. The war continued after the capture of Aguinaldo in March 1901 but was declared officially over by President Theodore Roosevelt on July 4, 1902 in an attempt to quell criticism of U.S. atrocities. At that time, the northern islands had been mostly pacified, but the conquest of southern islands was still ongoing and the struggle continued for years, though the United States from then on characterized the rebels as mere bandits. In the southern Philippines, the U.S. colonial army was at war with Muslim Filipinos or Moros. In 1906, what came to be known as the Moro Massacre was carried out by U.S. troops when at least 900 Filipinos, including women and children, were trapped in a volcanic crater on the island Oli_alone, shot at and bombarded for days. All of the Filipinos were killed while the U.S. troops suffered only a handful of casualties. Mark Twain responded to early reports with bitter satire. Leaving not even a baby alive to cry for its I/ir Girator Slovirin 6/ml was cum relic by high, C/iris limi soldier, off/L is likely to become more appealing among US and British elites. It should be remembered that Kipling's White Man's Burden was a call for the joint exploitation of the globe by what Duloi was later to call the white master's old world in the face of the ebbing British fortunes. At no time, then, should we underestimate the threefold threat of militarism, imperialism, and racism, or forget that capitalist societies have historically been eclentilegal with all three. 10. Is Iraq another Vietnam? Indication of just how bad things have become for the U.S. invaders and occupiers of Iraq is that comparisons with the Vietnam War are now commonplace in the U.S. media. In a desperate attempt to put a stop to this, President Bush intimated on April 13, in one of his rare press conferences, that the mere mention of the Vietnam analogy in relation to the present war was unpatriotic and constituted a betrayal of troops. Yet the question remains and seems to haunt the U.S. occupation of Iraq: to what extent has Iraq become another Vietnam for American imperialism? It is true that any direct comparison of two wars points to the enormous difference between them. In Iraq, the United States is not opposed, as in Vietnam, by a national liberation movement arising out of more than a century of revolutionary struggle against French and then American imperialism. The scale of U.S. military intervention in Iraq is much smaller than in Vietnam, and the number of casualties much smaller as well. The Cold War is long over. The geography of the Sea War is dilarated. Nevertheless, Iraq, like Vietnam in the previous century, is coming to stand for the limit sole American power. The United States is the sole remaining superpower, the greatest military power on earth. YCT its claim to omnipotence is now being shaken once again by popular resistance forces and _Ames F. Dobbins. The report insisted on the need of the United States to maintain its strategic commitment to Iraq even in the context of a transfer of authority in order to prevent interference by Iraq's neighbors, guarantee long-term stability in the production and supply of oil, block the emergence of a failed state that could offer a haven to terrorists, and avoid out of a planned 40,000 soldiers. Half of the 1st Battalion of New Army quit late last year on the grounds that the pay was inadequate. When the 2nd Battalion was called in to help light the Iraqi resistance in I-7 in April, many soldiers refused, saying that they had signed up to light Iraq's foreign enemies, not fellow Iraqis. One of the most serious problems for U.S. imperialism is that it views most of the Iraqi population as potential enemies of U.S. strategic interests in Iraq, and has no pro-imperial sector of the population to rely on for support. This contrasts with VLCLMNN, where its century of French colonialism had left behind a considerable urban middle and upper class population that allied itself with the United States once the French goals are interrelated. Pursuit of the economic and military objectives only U.S. imperialism precludes any quick solution of political crisis in Iraq. The primary purpose of the government, we are told, will be to set tip the LASIS for elections leading to the installation of a supposedly Ghanaian Iraqi government next year. In the meantime, and doubtless for some time to come, the real power governing Iraq will lie the U.S. in Illitai. According to existing plans, a U.S. withdrawal is still years away at best. Propaganda notwithstanding, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was not meant to stop Iraq from using weapons of mass destruction, nor was it to create a democracy in that country. The real motives of the war were to extend U.S. control over Iraqi oil supplies, the second largest reserve of oil in the world, and to create a major U.S. military presence in Iraq, probably taking the form of permanent military bases that would increase the U.S. hold over the entire Middle East. The presence of U.S. imperialism in Iraq was also supposed to help it to project its power beyond the Middle East into Central Asia, with its enormous supplies of oil and natural gas. These are the real spoils of war and have clearly been the primary concerns governing the U.S. intervention from the start. Any outcome that does not lead to continuing U.S. control by a combination of economic, political and military means of the Iraqi oil reserves will be deemed a failure by U.S. capitalism, since such control and the geopolitical power that it represents was a major objective of the invasion. Thus General J. Garner, the former head of the Iraq Occupation Authority, declared in an interview on BBC television on March 19, 2004, that privatization of oil and the promotion of a neoliberal economic model in Iraq had taken precedence in the administration plans over all else, including not only political changes but also restoring Iraqi electricity and water supplies. According to General Garner, the model used when he took over in Iraq saw the U.S. imperial role in that country as analogous to the Philippines, which in U.S. geopolitical strategy in the early 20th century had been in essence a coaling station for the Navy, allowing the U.S. military to project its power far into the Pacific and into Asia. In Garner's words, "I think it's a bad analogy, but I think we should look right now at Iraq as our coaling station in the Middle East, where we have some presence there. And it gives a settling effect there. And it also gives us a strategic advantage there, and I think we ought to just accept that and take that for a period of time, as long as the Iraqi people are willing to allow us to be guests in their country." Such spoils of war, viewed as means to the restoration of U.S. global hegemony in New York, will not be readily abandoned. There is every reason to believe therefore that the United are rooting back. This loss of credibility for U.S. imperial power is rightly regarded by those at the top of U.S. society as the greatest danger raised by the present war. It also represents the ultimate reason that the U.S. war machine and it difficult to withdraw, unless it can find some face-saving formula. This produces a momentum for a continuation and even escalation of the war. Yet there are also forces driving in the other direction. The most important of these is the growing Iraqi resistance. Another is the negative response with which U.S. allies are likely to greet any escalation of the war. Finally, there is the diminutive-ishing support for the war in the United States itself, which could translate eventually if further escalation occurs, into a powerful anti-war movement. At that point the Vietnam War analogy would be inescapable. I-0, L9, Greece, Korea, Iran, Guatemala, Indochina, Lebanon, the Congo, Cuba, Indonesia, the Dominican Republic, Chile, Angola INLL1L. TL. And on Urintenant http://LL_L Rhinia, L. L3L.30 imperialism have always been to open-tip invest corporations and to allow such corporations to gain preferential access to crucial natural resources. Inasmuch as such expansion promotes U.S. hegemony, it tends to increase the international co-competitiveness of U5NM and WPMLS the degree. At the same time U.S. imperialism promotes the intersals of the other core states and of capitalism as a whole insofar as that are civil. In his theory of barbarism and civilization, the geographical difference was associated with different modes of production. Civilized peoples lived on the most fertile soils where settled agriculture was feasible. Standing opposed to civilized, bread-eating peoples, who were principally city dwellers, were barbarians who were nomadic fighters living on meat and dairy and permanently under arms. Barbarians were seen as preferring force and living under circumstances where they had no recourse other than marauding and thievery, since confined to the wilderness and removed from arable lands. The notion of barbarism thus took on two meanings related to two conceptions of civilization. Insofar as civilization meant city dweller, barbarism meant non-city dweller, and particularly those living on the periphery. Insofar as civilization stood for the rule of law and culture, barbarism stood for the lack of both and the dominance of brutality. Barbarians were known for carrying out unconventional warfare. Confronted by the organized Roman army, the barbarians, Strabo wrote, carried on guerrilla warfare in swamps, in pathless forests, and in deserts. Nevertheless, the key aspect dividing civilization and barbarism, according to Strabo, was the differing mode of production of each. This was principally affect/ed by geography, with the more barbaric populations living in less fertile, more mountainous regions further north that bordered the ocean. Strabo allowed some cultural development among barbarian populations as they learned to cultivate more civilized modes of production. In fact, he described how some barbarians were no longer barbarians but were once Lauren. In particular, once the barbarians started producing meats and other raw materials for the Roman Empire, they were seen as more civilized. If in Greek and Latin literature civilization versus barbaristan was formed around a notion of center and periphery, early socialists, who viewed the feudalism that succeeded the Roman Empire in Western Europe as constituting a thousand years old universal barbarism, saw barbarism as a stage of development not implicant to the periphery. For French utopian socialist Charles Fourier, barbarism was the stage that preceded civilization. Barbarism was delineed by foreseeing the absolute enslavement of women. It came to its climax with the rise of large-scale slavery. Following in barbarism's wake, civilization, which he saw as typed by monogamous marriage and civil liberties for the wife and as introducing large-scale industry and the class struggle associated with it, was just as brutal in many ways as barbarism but more cunning in foamy. In fact, Fourier argued that civilization entailed the exploitation of the world's population and an increase in armed conflict. Wars and revolutions devastate successively every part of the globe. Political storms, for a moment lulled, break forth anew, multiplying like the heads of the Hydra beneath the blows of Hercules. Peace is but a delusion, a momentary dream, and industry, since an island of commercial monopolists and spoliators has embarrassed the intercourse of nations, discouraged the agriculture and manufactures of two continents, and transferred their workshops into nurseries of pauperism, industry, I say, has become the scourge of the toiling millions. The commercial spirit has opened new fields to fraud and rapine, spreading war and devastation over the two hemispheres and carrying the corrupt eos of civilized cupidity even into savage regions. Our ships circumnavigate the globe only to initiate barbarians and savages into our vices, our excesses, and our crimes. Thus civilization is becoming more and more odious as it approaches its end. The earth presents only a frightful political chaos, and involts the Armophenothor Hercules to purge it from the social abominations which disgrace it. The consequence oftly is globalizing and in a sense still barbaric mode of production was poverty and starvation for the vast majority of the world's population and the enrichment of a small segment of the people within civilized nations. Marx's treatment of barbarism, while scattered in his writings, was complex and reflected the numerous contradictions embedded in civilization or capitalism in his conception, which raised the possibility of degeneration as well as progress. He made references to barbarism both in relation to a stage of development and to issues of center-periphery. Marx also used the term barbarism to refer to the role of force and brutality in history and in capitalism specifically both at the levels of the class struggle and imperialism. In his ET/xenological notebooks written at the very end of his life, he took over the concept of barbarism as a stage of human development from the work of Lewis Henry Morgan. In his Ancient Society Morgan identified lower barbarism with the manufacture of pottery, mid-DLE barbarism with domestication of animals in the Eastern Hemisphere, irrigation, and the use of adobe brick and stone in architecture in the Western Hemisphere, and upper barbarism with the manufacture of iron and the invention of the phonetic alphabet. Much of Morgan's anthropological schema, including his treatment of barbarism as a stage lying between savagery and civilization, was taken over by Engels in The Origin QFTHE Family, Private Property, and the State. But it is Marx and Engels's more general use of term barbarism in relation to civilization and not the specific anthropological concept later taken from Morgan that most concerns us here. Marx saw exploitation under capitalism as frequently occurring under conditions that were barbaric, or that reflected the predatory nature of bourgeois civilization. Referring to the degradation and pollution of life that ensued with the rise of capitalism, he wrote in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, the crudest modus of human labor reappear. For example, the treadmill used by Roman slaves has become the mode of production and mode of existence of many English workers. In his 1847 speech on wages, Marx metaphorically referred to the use of treadmill in modern capitalist production as a disease. The treadmill, he observed, had re-emerged again within civilization. Barbarism reappears, but created in the lap of civilization itself and belonging to it, hence barbarism as leprosy of civilization. To understand the significance of Marx's critique, it is important to recognize the role that the treadmill occupied as a means of terrorizing and torturing workers who were consigned to it for a variety of offenses. Thus in L8 William Cubitt reintroduced English prisoners to the treadmill, which, according to a description in the October 1971 Simca 1 NM1C in 6 hours. The feat was the equivalent of climbing the stairs of the Washington Monument 16 times, allowing about 20 minutes for each trip. For Marx, this reintroduction of the treadmill stood for the tortuous, life-sapping phones of exploitation frequently employed by bourgeois civilization. The treadmill was a leprosy of civilization because, like that disease, it ate away the body, and because leprosy, which had been prevalent in Europe during the age of medieval barbarism, served as a metaphor for the reappearance of medieval barbarism in the lap of bourgeois civilization itself. Likewise in his Economic Manu.scnf, TOF 1861-63, Marx quoted a passage from the Russian economist Heinrich Friedrich von Storch that pointed to the degradation of the working conditions and the undermining of the health of wage workers as a reflection of the regression to barbarism that frequently accompanied the growth of bourgeois civilization. Marx also referred to barbarism in the sense of being outside the culture of civilization, isolated from the life of the cities and front social and political intercourse. In this sense he saw the French peasantry, which played a reactionary role in supporting Bonapartism, as the class that represented barbarism within civilization. The periodic breakdown of economic progress under capitalism and the poverty and hardship that this entailed, was itself a kind of regression, and hence Marx and Engels referred in Part 1 of the Co. 1N1 Nit 125 Manifesto to Economic Crisis as a state of momentary barbarism. The more global way in which Marx and Engels utilized the concept of barbarism, however, was in the treatment of relation between center and periphery of the capitalist world economy. In their panegyric to the bourgeoisie that comprised much of Part 1 of the Comrie-Melville Manifesto, they remarked how the bourgeoisie has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilizedens, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. Likewise they referred to the fact that the cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. Marx viewed Tsarist Russia, on the semi-periphery of Europe, as a bastion of barbarism threatening revolutionary movements in the West. But in his critique of colonialism, Marx was soon to invert his treatment of barbarism, which came to stand for what the inodern bourgeois of the capitalist West makes of himself when he can innoild Victorian holocausts, the coincidence of the imperialistic expropriation of the surplus of Indian society with vast famines and the imposition of starvation wages on Indian workers. Marx noted that British expansion was devastating India's industry, spreading misery and degradation, while reducing the country to a producer of agricultural raw materials for Britain. In fact, British imperialism sowed as a force of destruction, demolishing India's productive forces and causing underdevelopment even as it introduced the forces of modern industry into Indian society. In his treatment of the genesis of industrial capitalist in Capital, Volume 1, Marx quoted approvingly from William Howitt's Colonization MZDC/Tristamtally, in which Howitt had written, "The barbarities and desperate outrages of the so-called Christian race, throughout every region of the world, and upon every people they have been able to subdue, are not to be paralleled by those of any other race, however fierce, however untaught, and however reckless of mercy and of shame, in any age of earth." A common criticism of Marx's thought is that he saw history as inherently progressive. The work that is most widely taken as reflecting this extreme progressivism is the Communist Manifesto. Yet, at the very beginning of the manifesto, Marx and Engels noted, with respect to the class struggles that had governed the history of all hitherto existing civilization, that oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted now hidden now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of contending classes. The fall of the Roman Empire, which had succumbed to a common ruin of the contending classes, was followed in the West by a long period of medieval barbarism. Neither Marx nor Engels underestimated the role of force in history, or its regressive influence. History could therefore move forward toward socialism or backward toward barbarism, or worse, promote a more systematic, capitalist form of barbarism, naked in its imperialistic relations. Marx's analysis of ecological destruction wrought by capitalism the metabolism rifted _ pointed to the possibility of historical regression, as ruptures in the natural systems caused environmental crises for society. By robbing the soil and polluting the cities with wastes, capitalism undermined the material conditions of existence. All of civilization, he pointed out, left deserts in its wake. In the satire passage in the Economic and Philosophical MMM.Cre 1 Jatsoff 1844, in which he referred to the reintroduction of the treadmill, Marx also referred to the pollution generated in the industrial cities of Britain and the ecological destruction inlighted by capitalism. The raiment of needs and oft means of fooling them gives rise to a bestial degeneration. Even the need for fresh air ceases to be a need for the worker. Man reverts once more to living in a cave, but the cave is now polluted by the anapleitic and pestilential breath of civilization. Light, air, the simple stainable cleanliness ceases to be a need for man. Dirt, this pollution and putrefaction of man, the sewage of civilization, becomes an ekmeknel of for him. Engels in the part played by labor in the tran.sfonatum from A1 to MRM Rotoft human destruction of the natural environment and the undermining of civilization that this entailed. Human beings, he noted in his ecological writings, had increased the temperature of the earth in regions where forests had been extensively destroyed. None of this was compatible with a simple progressivist vision, suggesting rather that civilization carried a kind of reversion to barbarism within it as one potential line of evolution. LT was Rosa Luxemburg, who was to promote this aspect of Marx's dialectic in the context of global imperialist expansion, the crisis ol sermon social democracy, the First World War and the rise of prolo-fascism. LNL, December 1918, a month before she was murdered following the defeat of the Spartacist uprising, Luxemburg wrote an article entitled "What Do the Spartacists Want?" She declared that a choice presented itself: socialism or barbarism. LFTHE latter, the continuation of capitalist relations persisted, the future would entail new wars, famine, and disease. The dominant classes throughout history all shed streams of blood, they all marched over corpses, murder and arson, instigated civil war and treason, in order to defend their privileges and their power. The ongoing development of imperialistic barbarism promised to be more brutal and treacherous, threatening to turn much off-world into a smoking heap of rubble. Socialism, Luxemburg contended, has become necessary not merely because the proletariat is no longer willing to live under conditions imposed by the capitalist class, but, rather, because if the proletariat fails to fulfill its class duties, if it fails to realize socialism, we shall crash down together in a common doom. The fate that barbarism represented was thus man's common ruin of the contending classes. In her famous 1mu5 pam/LLCL, written a few years earlier while she was imprisoned for protesting the First World War, Luxemburg pointed to reactionary tendencies and the horrific possibilities of a Second World War that would be even more devastating in its implications. Already, capitalists were prolting from the destruction, as cities are turned into shambles, whole countries into deserts, villages into cemeteries, whole nations into beggars. Capitalism goes forth into the world wading in blood and dripping with LTH. As a roaring beast, as an orgy of anarchy, as a pestilential breath, devastating culture and humanity, so it appears in all its hideous nakedness. The triumph of imperialism involved the destruction of all culture, and, as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a vast cemetery. It was in this context that she referred to the ruins of imperialistic barbarism. Socialism in contrast allured the possibility of a new world. Luxemburg pointed especially to the destruction leveled on the periphery in Africa, the Middle East, and China, regions that had been targeted for conquest by European imperialists. All the riches of the earth would be sub_jugateto cap. Italian, the world's population converted into wage slaves. The civilized world, which she properly placed in quotes, had turned into the liercest, most brutal form of barbarism the world had ever seen, and as it was with weapons of fear-sought destruction and propelled forward by an insatiable urge for economic expansion. The civili 7.eings were tortured to death by a band of European industrial robber barons, and the remnants of a whole people were eaten into cripples, when in China an ancient civilization was delivered into the hands of destruction and anarchy, with fire and slaughter, by the European soldiery, when Persia gasped in the noose of the foreign rule of force that closed in. Coral, lie about her throat, when in Tripoli the Arabs were mowed down, with fire and sword, under the yoke of capital, while their civilization and their homes were razed to the ground. This civilized world has just begun to know that the fangs of the imperialist beast are deadly, that its breath is frightfulness, that its tearing claws have sunk deep into the breasts of its own mother, European culture. And this belated recognition is coming into the world of Europe in the distorted form of bourgeois hypocrisy, that leads each nation to recognize infamy only when it appears in the uniform of other. They speak of sermon barbarism, as if a very people that goes out for organized murder did not change into a horde of barbarians. They speak of Cossack horrors, as if war itself were not the greatest of all horrors. Inspired by Luxemburg's analysis, the Sri Lankan Marxist G.V.S. de Silva further developed the concept of Barl-arism. In his book The Alternatives, Socialism or Barlzarism, he argued that the traditional Marxist notion of modes of production evolving from capitalism to socialism to communism needed to be revised. Capitalism did not necessarily lead to socialism or socialism necessarily to communism. Rather, both capitalism and socialism could degenerate into barbarism, which presented a brutal alternative to communism. Barbarism in de Silva's conception was to be defined as a society relying simultaneously on force, ideological control on the scale of Orwell's 1984, the destruction of all countervailing power so that economic interests can rule directly with a minimal state, induced consumption of useless products designed to distract the population, and the extreme domination of nature in all of its aspects. Short Ola revolutionary. Change in the qualitative dimensions of global economy and an end to capitalist exploitation of nature, the specter of barbarism would continue to haunt humanity. Thus, de Silva concluded ominously, barbarism in one or two powerful countries will overwhelm the rest of humanity. Today the world is facing what de Silva feared war, and is threatening to destabilize the entire globe. In the late 20th century, the further growth of monopoly capital led to a heavy reliance, particularly for the United States as the hegemonic state of the world system, on military spending and imperialist intervention. With the waning of the Cold War, this dependence of the imperial superpower on the most barbaric means of advancing its interests and controlling the system has only increased. The continuing decline of U.S. economic hegemony, occurring alongside deepening economic stagnation in capitalism as a whole, has led the United States to turn increasingly to extra economic means of maintaining its position, putting its huge war machine in motion in order to prop up its faltering hegemony over the world economy. The global war on terror is a manifestation of this latest lethal phase of U.S. imperialism, which began with the 1991 Gulf War, made possible by the breaking up of the Soviet bloc and the emergence of the United States as the sole superpower. After the terrorist attack on September 11, 2001, the empire could present itself as at war with barbarism and in defense of civilization. The barbarians have already knocked at the gates, declares Niall Ferguson, New York University professor of history and leading defender of British and U.S. imperialism. But today's barbarians, he charges, are Islamic fundamentalists, and liberal imperialism becomes a way of inoculating the world against such Islamic terrorism. While the knock on the gates represents a clear danger to the U.S. dominated imperial order, these external terrorist groups, Ferguson contends, will not bring about the decline of the U.S. imperium directly. Instead, the principal threat to the position of the United States in the global economy is internal. It is rooted in an unwillingness on the part of the U.S. state to make a hill claim to its position at the head of the global empire. Ferguson, who believes that the British Empire of old should be emulated albeit in a form worthy of the 21st century, argues that the world needs an empire. Many nations would be better ally dominated by the United States than having full independence. The United States, he claims, is one guns and butter empire that represents not just the rule of Henry but the advance of the principles of liberal empire and liberal bounty, thus yielding a more technocratic and prosperous world order. It is no mere coincidence that Ferguson, one of the most influential establishment historians today, explicitly calls for an updating of the old white man's burden while ultiwashing one of the most barbaric wars of modern imperialism, the Plilopan Amid Wankan War at the beginning of 20th century. L7 Ferguson's guns and butter empire is now a transparent objective of U.S. policy. With the fall of the Soviet Union, as LSTVN Mazaros explained, the United States began to assume the role of the state of the capital system as such, subsuming under itself by all means at its disposal all rival powers. With its immense military power and its willingness to use force, the United States hopes to expel potential competitors permanently in check, a strategy that is likely to spell global disaster in the long run. In attempting to prevent revolution, the United States is seeking to transcend the only certain law of the universe, change. In the process, it has given birth to dictators, supported terrorists, and threatened the world with violent destruction. In the Middle East, the United States has nurtured a regressive, fundamentalist political Islam that insofar as it turns back and bites the hand that fed it, the United States and its allies, is branded as a new barbarism. 2 years ago, Amr Moussa, head of the Arab League and former Egyptian foreign minister, predicted that the gates of hell would be opened if the United States invaded Iraq. In Cairo this fall he reprised this view, observing that now the gates of hell are open in Iraq. Although he was scolded by some for his statement 2 years ago, this time around, according to USA Today, there was no dissent. It is clear that the US invasion and occupation has created a bloodbath in Iraq that will continue for years, given the ferocious guerrilla war that Iraqi Shave launched in response. The US position in Iraq is deteriorating. The occupying forces have lost control over whole sections of the country. In October, bombings occur, symbol of US defeat in imperialist wars. Barbarism has always been associated with torture. Marx's comments on the treadmill were aimed at the role this instrument of production played in torturing workers while reinforcing bourgeois social relations. IIE explored the systematic use of torture by British colonialism in India in his article Investigations of Tortures in India, and saw the outrages of the revolted sepoys in India as a historical retribution for such acts by their British oppressors. The systematic use of torture by the United States in Abu Ghraib in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and on its base in Guantanamo Bay, over the coming century. Yet the United States has steadily increased its carbon dioxide emissions since 1990. It leads the world in overall emissions, with per capita emissions at over 5 times the world average, and shows no signs of reversing this trend, regardless of the devastating consequences this may have. As Marx came to invert the historical treatment of barbarism as he condemned the colonial systems of his day, we need to recognize the barbarism of the strong and their culpability in creating this new age. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, the voice of the new barbarism, recently stated, "At some point the Iraqis will get tired of jetting El-Iled." 7. Presumably he was referring to Iraqis killed by suicide bombers. Nevertheless, his statement remains inhuman in its implications in the context of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. Once it has been declared, there is no end to the global war on terror, which ought to be called the global war of terror. Only the transcendence of capitalism, in the direction of socialism, offers the possibility to escape from the current state of barbarism that is paving the way to new global holocausts and a worsening ecological collapse. Daniel Singer wrote at the end of his Whose Millennium, "Socialism may be a historical possibility, or even escaserito eliminate the evils of capitalism, but this does not mean that it will inevitably take its place." 2. We should heed his warning. The choice that we confront and that we will ultimately decide through our struggles is whether socialism or the ruins of imperialistic barbarism is to constitute the future of humankind. 13. The failure of empire. The United States is facing the prospect of a major defeat in Iraq that is likely to constitute a serious setback in the ongoing campaign to expand the American empire. Behind the pervasive war propaganda as evident in the victorious attack on Fallujah lies the reality of a US war machine lighting a futile battle against growing guerrilla forces, with little chance for a stable political solution to the conflict that could possibly meet US imperial objectives. Nevertheless, the US ruling class, though not unaware of the dangers, is currently convinced that it has no choice but to stay the course, a slogan adopted by both political parties and accepted by virtually the entire economic, political, military, and communications establishment. The reason for this seemingly irrational determination to stick it out at all costs can only be understood through an analysis of the logic and limits all capitalist empire. Capitalism is by its very nature a globally expanding system geared to accumulation on a world scale. Since its beginnings in the 13th and 16th centuries, it has been a world economy with an international division labor ruled over by competing nation-states. Cutting across this global system is a structure of inequality variously described as center-periphery, metropolis-satellite, developed and underdeveloped, north-south all which point to the wide gap that exists between states at the center and those in the periphery of the system. From the outset, the leading capitalist states engaged in an outward, imperialistic movement. Pre-capitalist societies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia were pillaged, their populations chained, and the plunder sent back to Europe. Wherever possible, non-capitalist societies were destroyed and transformed into colonial dependencies. Meanwhile, the great powers fought over the territories and spoils. As Marx wrote in The Genesis of Industrial Capitalist in Volume IOL's Interventions to advance its national security interests. This was nothing other than a declaration of perpetual war, making it clear that the United States was willing to brandish its armed might in order to expand its empire and thus its geopolitical position in the world at large. Never before in the history of modern world has any nation laid claim to such a far-reaching strategy for indefinite global domination. Helping to pave the way for this reassertion of U.S. imperial ambitions was a transformation in the dominant historical account of the Vietnam War. Conservative interpretations of the war propounded by the military leadership and right-wing commentators at first scarcely taken seriously in the public became more influential and pervasive as memories of the war receded. In the new climate of making America stand tall again, the defeat in Vietnam was increasingly relegated to the classic propagandistic category of a betrayal brought on in this case by the Zulu War. This did not appreciably dampen British determination to defend and expand the empire, it made them hunger for vengeance. If Americans cannot adopt a similarly bloody-minded attitude, then they have no business undertaking imperial policing. But adoption of a bloody-minded attitude, something that is not lacking at present in Washington, will not save the United States in Iraq. Despite the much proclaimed victory in Fallujah, where the level of destruction unleashed against a city in an already occupied country is probably unequaled in modern times, war planners are working overtime to find a way to stave off a defeat that appears increasingly likely. The most important recent treatment of the Iraq War from within the national security establishment has coied from Anthony H. Cordesman, a longtime national security advisor for the Department of Defense, specializing in the Middle East and energy issues, who oversaw the assessment of the Yom Kippur War for the Defense Department in 1974. Cordesman is now a fellow in strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington and the national security analyst for ABC News. In his report Playing the Course as Slow Ralligy for RT/Tafted U.S. Policy in IRM and Using Iraq as a Tool or Lever for Changing the Region, Using Iraq as a U.S. military base, interfering with Iraq's independence in terms of its politics, economics, and above all oil, and blocking total transparency in the U.S. relation to the Iraqi economy. U.S. assurances, he insists, must include its explicit commitment to withdraw entirely from the Green Zone in Baghdad, which cannot be maintained as an imperial headquarters in a supposedly independent Iraq. The United States, Cordesman advises, should narrow its objectives to the creation of a stable government backed up by an adequate Iraqi military force, even if the new political regime is only moderately better than that of Saddam Hussein and even if openly antagonistic to the United States. If Washington can succeed even to this extent, he says, it can declare victory and get out within 2 years with a minimum amount of damage to its credibility as an imperial power. However, in case it should fail to create a stable political solution or to create an adequate Iraqi army within that period, as now appears most likely, the United States needs to start making plans immediately for what it will do in the case of a clear defeat. Even victory in Iraq, we are told, will be highly relative, and defeat, which can occur in any number of ways as Iraq spins out of control, will force the U.S. to reinforce its position in the entire region. Even more important than the formation of a stable regime, from Cordesman's standpoint, is the replacement of U.S. with Iraqi forces. Iraqization, he writes, either has to be made to work, or Iraq will become a mirror image of the failure of Vietnamization in Vietnam. Coalition military victories will become increasingly irrelevant. After a detailed assessment of Iraqi forces and training, he concludes the Iraq military and security forces are now far too weak to take over the security mission and will almost certainly remain so well into 2005. The US can only play the course effectively if it works out goals and plans with the Iraqi interim government that go far beyond the 28,000-man armed forces and the roughly 55,000 man total of military, paramilitary, and National Guard the US currently says are required. The truth is that the presence of 150,000 US troops in Iraq, which has stretched available US forces to the limit, has not been enough, even when supplemented by troops from Britain, to bring the country to heel. The US has already learned that it can win virtually any direct military battle or clash, but it cannot secure the country. As in Vietnam, if the interim Iraqi government cannot win the political battle, US victories in the military battles become irrelevant. Given the political turmoil in Iraq and the difficulty of creating any political solution, or even avoiding the outbreak of civil war, THIRD-WORLDISm believes that the United States needs to concentrate on how to shore up its position in the remainder of Middle East in the event of a defeat. Fighting a counterinsurgency campaign is one thing, the US must not stay if Iraq devolves into civil war. No one can guarantee success in Iraq, or that Iraq will not descend into civil war, come under a strongman, or split along ethnic or confessional lines. It is one thing to play the game and quite another to try to deal with defeat by reinforcing failure or doubling the battle. It is clear by 2006 that the US cannot win with its current level of effort, or the situation serious deteriorates to the point where it is clear there is no new Iraq government and security force to aid, the game is over. There no longer is time to fold, it is time to run. If forced to run, he says, the United States will have to offer reassurances to the rulers of the friendly Gulf states and other allies. It will have to prevent any expansion of Islamic Jihad in Afghanistan resulting from Islamic declarations of victory in Iraq. At the same time, the United States will have to keep Iran from intervening in Iraq. More pressure than ever will be placed on the United States to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Finally, the threat to U.S. strategic position with respect to Middle Eastern oil will have to be planned for, requiring that the United States not withdraw from the Middle East but if anything step up its involvement. THIRD-WORLDISm leaves no doubt that the major issue for the United States in Iraq as in the Middle East as a whole is oil. Continual attacks on the oil pipelines by the Iraqi resistance have limited the Ames Schlesinger, and Fortner U.S. ambassador to Russia and Undersecretary for Political Affairs under Clinton, Thomas Pickering editorialized in the Los Angeles Times that Iraq should remain above politics and that the United States should stay the course. The reasons they offered included preventing Iran from influencing Iraq, guaranteeing long-term stability in the production and supply of oil, blocking the rise of a new power in Iraq opposed to the United States, and avoiding a perception of American defeat that would serve to destabilize American power and its interests both in the Middle East and globally. In short, the imperial objectives for which the United States intervened in the region must be maintained at all costs. Nothing coming out of Washington these days suggests that this dominant view is altered in any way. Although it is well understood among those at the top of the social hierarchy that a series of disasters may well await the United States in Iraq if it simply sticks to its guns, to not do so is seen as guaranteeing a still big disaster, a confession of defeat that will diminish the future U.S. capacity to make war at will on third world societies and thus to employ force directly as a means to promote its imperial designs. Moreover, there is still the question of Iraqi oil and who will control it. Thus in the ruling class view, even an absolute failure in establishing a stable political regime and the requisite military force to defend it in Iraq does not necessarily mean that the United States should get out. Thomas Friedman, columnist on foreign affairs at the new YBR/TTF1IL.I, whose views can usually be taken as a good barometer of a stabilizal opinion, includes a November 18, 2004, report from Iraq with the statement that without a secure environment in which its new leadership can be elected and comfortably operate, Iraq will never be able to breathe on its own, and U.S. troops will have to be here forever. The attitude here is that the US occupation would need to continue endlessly in the case of a failure to realize the goal of a stable political situation in Iraq acceptable to the United States. Given the enormous Iraqi oil reserves, Washington could decide that whatever costs it had to pay in Iraq would be amply rewarded in the end. If the foregoing reading of US leadership's current determination to stay the course is right, then the failures to be experienced by US imperialism in Iraq are likely to persist and be all the greater. The continuing presence of US troops will mean that the US military will continue to take its bloody toll, and Iraqi opposition to the American liberators will only grow. Meanwhile, any Iraqi government that is elected under these circumstances will either have to be opposed to the US occupation or lose any CLA.IMSOF legitimacy within Iraqi society. The US invasion and occupation of Iraq may be creating the conditions for a civil war, lighting a powder keg under the entire Middle East. To get an idea of just how serious this can be, one has only to look at present Israeli arming and training of the Kurdish militias, with the object of then setting them if need should arise against Shiite or Sunni forces in Iraq. Israel's possession of hundreds of nuclear weapons poses the continual threat of the Samson option should that government perceive itself or its occupation of Palestine as seriously threatened. Wider speculation at this point would be foolhardy. But there is no doubt that in invading Iraq the United States opened the doors of hell not only for the Iraqis and the Middle East as a whole but also for its own global imperialist order. The full repercussions of the failure of US empire in Iraq have yet to be seen and will only become evident in the months and years ahead.